Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Tony hacked into S.H.I.E.L.D. to track down missing weapons? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Prologue. Loki doesn't scream as his back collides with the wall, jarring his bruised side and sending a jolt of agony from his chest to his toes. He is aware, distantly, that his last rib has just cracked. It presses inwards, sharp and tearing, and he doesn't care, does not care. Part of him even hopes it will pierce something. Be an end. The rest of him knows he's not that lucky. He laughs. It is the wrong move, but there are no right moves in this hole he's been thrown into. Just the cold glass mirrors which show him himself every single way he looks. Mirrors which reflect bright lights and blood straight into his eyes and which he is certain are two-way devices, easily seen through from the other side. He wonders if the puny mortals are laughing at him. He knows the Norns are. A booted foot, steel-capped and strong, slams into his side, forcing his breath out in a soundless gasp. Blood dribbles down the side of his face and he doesn't know whether it comes from inside or out anymore. His face is a broken mask of red and purple and he stinks of copper and vomit and the sharp disinfectant they clean him with once a week if they remember. He remembers once, just once, screaming for Thor. But that had been before. He is a monster. He deserves this, he knows. But some small, crushed part of him, the part which still knows how to scream when they come at night and the lights dim and there is only coldness and grunting and pain, the part that wants to know what he needs to do to stop this, doesn't want Thor to see him like he is now. Wants his hated not brother to remember him as more than a worthless heap of nothing. Rough hands drag him up by the collar around his neck. Words form, the wind of them rushing against his face. They sting, burning and burning until he tries to claw at the hands to just make them stop. He can't breathe. Can't breathe. The blackness is closing in and he needs to fight it because he isn't helpless and he hates being helpless on the damp, cold metal of his cell floor. And then there is the bruising pain as he is pushed to the ground. One hand is splayed to block his fall and there is a sharp snap as something gives way. Another wave of pain rattles up his arm. It's hilarious really, that the mortals think this will break him. He lets out another wheeze of a laugh. The door clangs once, and heavy boots thud off into the distance, sated for now, but his skin prickles like a million eyes are watching him. Or maybe that is just Heimdall. Now he lacks the magic to shield himself from the watcher's gaze. It is strange, he thinks, that with all his magic bound he still isn't blue. It is there though. Lurking beneath the skin. Waiting for him under the red. He needs to move. It is too open here, in the middle of the room with air on all sides. He needs to shift, to drag himself away to a corner even though he knows it won't help. He's moved less than a meter when he is hit by the swirling blackness. And then there is nothing but frost and snow and burning ice. Chapter 1. All I'm saying is it's not my concern, Tony says, rolling his eyes and sending Steve a lazy glare. They're upstairs, in the lounge, because Steve doesn't have access to the workshop and the workshop doesn't have alcohol. The dark-haired inventor is leaning back on a white couch, glass in hand. And the super soldier is pacing in front of him, blue eyes deadly serious. I saw those prototypes, Stark. I held them. And those terrorists last Thursday were using the exact same technology. Not my concern. The Avengers are great. Don't get me wrong, Captain. But the US has been dealing under the table for years. It's not news. And if it is, you'd be better off taking it to the press. That's a lie, of course. He'd know. Not that he really wants Captain America to know that. But barring flying around the world to destroy shipments, there's really not much which can be done. Steve frowns. All I'm asking is for you to hack into their security. I just want to know if S.H.I.E.L.D. is behind this or not. You've done it before, Stark. And now it is Tony's turn to frown, because honestly, Steve has a point. It's just that it's Steve saying it. Half of him wants to make sure he isn't working with another OB and the other half tells him ignorance is bliss, and even if they are dealing under the tables it could just be an OB situation S.H.I.E.L.D. has under control already. S.H.I.E.L.D. wouldn't be S.H.I.E.L.D. if they weren't running the long con with someone. It won't prove anything, Tony reasons, internal traitor, weapons thefts, deleted accounts. The records prove nothing. Steve nods anyway, eyes dark. It gives me somewhere to start, he replies steadily, and remembering back to the dead apartments, Tony can't say no, he probably should. Jarvis, see if you can give us the SHIELD records for weapons shipments, he says eventually, not looking at Steve as he gives in. He pulls out a laptop, fingers tapping idly on the white armrest as the login data processes. 10 minutes later the records are up there, every inch as slick and neat as official government documents could be. 5 more minutes later and the unofficial records are there as well. Nothing relating to the Mark II guns anyway. It's interesting to see Latveria and North Korea on the unofficial shipments list. Happy, Captain? Tony asks. Fury should be told someone's been stealing his shipments, Steve says. Tony disagrees, privately. The austere director, he is certain, knows exactly which shipments have and haven't arrived. Though he's been different after Coulson. Go ahead then, Boy Scout. Maybe he'll give you a medal. This isn't about a medal, Stark. It's about doing what's right. I would have thought Howard Stark's son would have known that. Yeah? Well maybe, if he hadn't spent so much time running off looking for you he'd have had the time to teach me. But Tony cuts himself off before the treacherous words can fly free. His father did love him. He knows that now. Shit at expressing it, at acting on it, but at least it was there. Well maybe I'm just not my father, he amends. I'm not asking you to be, the super soldier says, unexpectedly, I'm asking you to stop treating saving lives and helping people like a joke. Oh, trust me, I never treat, sir, Jarvis cuts across smoothly, I think you should see this. Jarvis, I'm talking here, Tony says indignantly, but then goes as still as the good captain does beside him. In front of them is a visual of a cell. It is not a standard holding cell. There are mirrors everywhere making things creepy as hell and there is blood all over the floor and walls and ceiling. Or are they just reflections? And there is someone in there. If the crimson mass sprawled face down on the ground can be called a someone. It lies like a broken doll, one limb twisted unnaturally out to the side, cloths torn and ripped to reveal bruises and blood and more blood. An iron collar twisted about the throat like some perverted, self-devouring snake. A mark of ownership? But this is America. This is SHIELD headquarters. Not some backwater place like Afghanistan or Iraq where you can tell yourself it's okay because it's nice and far away from home. Tony just manages to make it to the trash can in time to heave. Steve is pale, but his eyes are blazing. Of course. He was a soldier so of course he's probably seen worse than this. Tony wonders if that means he doesn't feel the revulsion or if it just means he is better at hiding it. Who is that? Tony rasps when he's made it back to the seat. He wipes his mouth with a tissue, unable to get rid of the bitterness. He is identified as prisoner number 67. There is no name listed on his records, sir. No name? None, sir. That's disgusting. America has rules. Standards. We're better than this, Steve says, hands clenching and unclenching rapidly. I hear you, Captain. Preaching to the choir. Because all Tony can see in the dark-haired figure on the floor is him. You know what? Why don't we go to HQ now to complain about those weapon shipments? You'd get there a hell of a lot faster if I flew you there in my suit. Steve nods grimly. Smart. They arrived there in 1 hour. Ooh, in the end, it's Tony who says he wants to talk to Fury about weapons. Mainly this is because Steve can't lie to save his life and that actually works for him when he's wandering the bowls of a ship looking for number 67. No one's suspicious. They've both got earpieces connected to Jarvis to keep them in contact. So while he's talking to an increasingly irate Fury about misplaced weapons shipments, Tony's also getting periodic updates like, still fine, and, wrong way. He knows he should probably hold his tongue when Fury starts on responsibility and trust and saving lives. Knows like he knows the whole point of this is to pretend they were never interested in the fate of prisoner number 67. But somehow the words tear free, and he curses himself even as he remembers the broken body because he's just drastically reduced the chances of this not being tied back to them. What the hell is prisoner number 67 then? He asks. Fury's eye narrows and the effect is somehow just as intimidating as if he'd had two. None of your concern, Stark. I'm at his cell. All they need now is time, and one hell of a dose of luck. Tony manages to choke any reply down, nodding stiffly instead. But Fury doesn't stop there. There's something compelling him to continue, push on. He deserves every damn thing he's getting, and Tony has to fight not to step back from the dark hatred in that deep voice, every damn thing. And suddenly he doesn't recognize him. Because Fury hasn't been the same since Coulson left, but to go this far. His daddy agreed to it. Made the clone to take back to wherever the hell he came from. Keep up the noble image. And suddenly as the stranger's voice rolls on out of Fury's mouth, Tony wants to be sick again. He almost wants there to be blue in Fury's eye because then it wouldn't be him. But it's brown the way it always is. Loki. That thing on the floor was the laughing, insane demigod who'd pushed him out a window and had the balls to ask him for a drink after everything else? I've got him. No one's noticed the transfer. Well, that made sense actually. Jarvis had been ordered to swap camera feeds just as soon as they'd done the switch. It showed only pre-recorded footage now. Shit, Fury. We're the good guys, Tony says. Fury's eye is still that of a stranger. Leave it, Stark. It's not your concern. And Tony wonders just why he ever thought working for S.H.I.E.L.D. would be synonymous with saving the world. He departs a few minutes later, leaving Fury brooding. Hill gives him a long look as he leaves. She nods once, eyes unreadable, and goes back to examining schematics. Tony suddenly wonders if the ease of proceedings was a complete coincidence. Steve is waiting out the back on the platform no one uses unless there's an emergency. Jarvis disabled the cameras. Number 67 is with him. But the face is a mess and nothing but the hair color and high GI. And all Tony can think is shit because if he were Loki he'd burn the world again for this, but he can't just leave him. Can't put him back in there, even though the colder part of his brain tells him he should. Steve looks faintly sick as he holds his burden. Stark, he says, I think they. He can't continue but the expressive gesture at the torn clothes says enough. Tony wishes Steve hadn't told him that. He wonders if Coulson would hate this as much as he does. He hopes so. Come here, he says, I can carry the both of you. And then they're gone, flying away to Stark Tower and Tony's trying not to panic as he sets Steve down and his armor is taken off by Jarvis like a two-piece by a butler. This is Loki. This is an insane demigod with a mind control stick and enough raw power to fuel a nuclear bomb. This is a maniac with more power issues than Hitler. This is. His eyes drift downwards to the limp, battered figure. This is someone who needs help. They end up putting Loki in a spare bedroom. I wonder who he was, Steve says, staring at the figure sprawled on the bed. Tony wishes Pepper were here so he wouldn't have to sponge the blood away from the face and the throat and the hell. Why did they put him on the bed? He needs a bath, Tony says with certainty. They carry him through and dump him in the water tub and Tony mentally apologizes to him for undressing him and hopes he won't wake up. It's very awkward to be crouched, fully clothed and wet, trying to support a man who tried to kill you and subjugate Earth 3 months ago. This suit definitely going to be burnt though, it's covered in brown filth by the time they're done. Eventually though, the green-eyed maniac is clean and they dress him and carry him through to the bed again. All his ribs are broken and so are his arm and 4 fingers. There's cuts, bruising and swelling everywhere. Tony wonders if he should call in a doctor or take him to hospital, but he knows S.H.I.E.L.D. The fewer people know about this the better and Thor seemed to heal fast from Hulk punches and dagger thrusts. Maybe. Hopefully. The broken figure on the bed is like his brother. Steve sits down. There's a mixture of pity and disgust and protectiveness on his face which almost hurts. Tony says, he's Loki because he feels he should. Steve looks confused. But I thought, he says, and Tony sighs. So did I until Fury told me it wasn't my concern and his dad had handed him over to this. His dad, Steve echoes. There's horror in his eyes. Yup. But his magic? Caller. There is silence for a bit. Tony sits down too. Nothing is said because they can't think of anything to say. Tony leaves a few minutes later for the workshop. They don't know how to contact Thor, so they don't try. Loki wakes 2 days later. Chapter 2 He wakes to a feeling of alien softness. It digs into his bruises in a way he hasn't felt in months and he's clean. Clean and sore and not smelling like concentrated lemons. It's strange. He forces open bruised eyelids because he needs to know where he is. It doesn't matter but he wants to know. It's a clean little room with lemon yellow walls and a matching cream carpet and roof. A bookshelf and a chest of drawers are poked into the corners, empty and bare, and a little doorway at the side might be a bathroom. There's a rustling beside him and he jerks sharply, aware of the pain in his neck and doubly aware he doesn't care. He doesn't expect to see the good captain next to him. Captain Discus with his illogically indestructible shield. The super soldier looks like Thor, and for a moment Loki can't quite place why until he sees the blue eyes which seem to look at him rather than straight through him and which overflow with regret. He wonders why. Maybe someone else died and the captain has come to punish him for that, too. He withdraws a little, shrinking away from the man. His side screams but he moves anyway because he's dealt with pain before, but somehow the bed makes the other so much worse. He bumps into the wall and there's nowhere to run. He tries to force air through his mouth to shape the words he wants to say. Words to wound and disgust and keep at bay. But all that escape his mangled throat are whimpers. Rogers leans forwards on the bed, one hand outstretched. It drops to his side a moment later and he doesn't know why. He sits there, curled up in a ball against the wall, eyes wide and fixed on the blonde man who is not Thor but who is not yet hurting him. He tries not to blink, even when his eyes start to burn. Rogers' mouth moves and words are slipping out. It takes him a moment to decipher them. "I'm not going to hurt you," they say, and surely they are lies, but what is the point? "What did they do to you?" he says, but it's rhetorical because Loki can see in his eyes that he knows. He doesn't understand Rogers' concern. They aren't friends. Aren't S.H.I.E.L.D. companions. They're enemies, so why does it matter what happened? Why does it matter what the Dark One, Fury, and Father chose to do with him to punish him? Why does it matter? Loki manages to choke out. Green eyes narrow and sharp as broken glass. He deals with the punishments he's given. He's good at that. There's no reason to help him. Why does it matter? I wouldn't let that happen to Red Skull, the super soldier bites out. Loki blinks and his eyes slip down to the blankets. He plays with the hem with fingers too thin and too pale from lack of food and exercise. Is Rogers not here to punish him? He's too tired for this and he can't relax. Can't remember the last time he slept without utter exhaustion to smooth its path. But that's a lie, of course. Only it feels like it happened to someone else. Some other Loki before the coronation and the fall. He stays there, arm and side throbbing, staring absently at the purple bruising. It's almost artwork. He wishes Rogers would go and not stare at him like a rancid blob of meat, but he knows it won't make a difference if he says so. There's a creak as the chair shifts, and he flinches involuntarily, eyes shooting upwards. Pathetic, really, being cowed by humans, and fitting. Rogers has risen. "If you want anything, just call. You're safe now," he says, choking a little on that last part, and then he's gone, the door sliding shut behind him. Loki feels a flicker of disbelief. No one ever leaves just because he wants them to. But he's alone again in the little room, and there's a window through which he can actually see. There are no mirrors. Little by little he begins to straighten out. He hurts. He allows himself to feel it now that he is alone. Skilled fingers probe his ribs. They are out of alignment and he'll need to shift them back in place if he wants them to heal properly. In battle this is something he's done many times before. This time will be no different. There's a shift which pinches a nerve, sending raw fire rippling through every muscle, and he has to bite his lip to stop himself from crying out, but at last it's right again. 23 to go. He faints before he moves beyond the 11th. Ooh. Tony's listening to music, volume on max, testing out a new laser when the door slides open. He spins around in his chair. He stops abruptly as his gaze meets that of Steve. Tony, he's awake. Tony frowns at the tone. And at the Tony. But there's a part of him that's saying, "Captain America is calling me by name," which makes him suddenly warm. Hasn't tried to blow you up or strangle you, has he? No, Steve admits, I almost wish he had, in a way. He looked at me like, Steve breaks off. His gaze is haunted. No offense, Cap, Tony says bluntly, but it took me. He cuts himself off because Afghanistan's the last thing he wants to talk about with Steve. It takes people a bit to trust after they've had what he had happen. We're his enemies. Do villains even have friends? If I can't think of an objective reason we sprung a supervillain as insane as he is from prison, he probably can't. No good ones, anyway, Tony amends. Steve slumps and sits down. Tony feels for him. He does. Half the time in his missions, the undramatic, not saving America type. Like when he killed the gang hunting refugees in Afghanistan. He looks at the faces and thinks, and what the hell did they do next? He tells himself they're better off than they were. That's all he can do, but he remembers their faces sometimes and wonders. I just feel. Steve struggles to put it into words. I mean, I know I didn't do it. But I was with S.H.I.E.L.D. And with them. And it's disgusting. Tony nods. Steve gathers himself. I should have known and I should have stopped it. The words are bare. Tony rises and pours himself a drink. Tall order, he says, taking a gulp of the amber liquid and enjoying the way it burns all the way down. Why should we have known? It's not like we had a reason to hack security. Steve looks pale. You didn't see the way he looked at me. He was scared, Tony. Scared of what I'd do, and scared I'd be exactly as bad as S.H.I.E.L.D. Tony takes another fortifying sip of the scotch. So, all it means is he doesn't trust us and has every reason to believe we hate him. Can't help that you're probably twice as strong as him. And honestly, when I think of Coulson even I want to punch him. Not saying I would, not now, but you know, I'd be more worried if he did trust us on sight. I'd wonder what he was up to. The blonde soldier doesn't look entirely reassured. I'm staying until he heals, he says. Tony shrugs and nods. Honestly, he's grateful he's not being dumped with this on his own. It's just that it's hard to find the right words to say so. He turns back to his laser, and when he looks back up Steve is gone. Jarvis, alert me when our reposing guest wakes, would you? And tell Pepper I want bandages, plaster and no blabbing to any of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s boys. Girls. Whatever. Ooh. When Loki wakes he hears a knock on the door. It comes once, then twice and finally it occurs to him that they are waiting for him to let them in. Go away, he calls. Sleeping Beauty rouseth from her slumber. Stark's voice echoes through the doorway. I have plaster for the arm. And breakfast. Coffee. That's got to count for something, right? The tone is oddly hopeful. And there's something disarming about it. Maybe it's that without the suit he can throw Stark out the window or choke him or do something aside from scream and laugh and beg if he doesn't want to think about it. Fine, he calls, summoning pride to drape him like a cloak and wishing he looked more intimidating than he probably does in the Iron Man pajamas he's been dressed in. He doesn't get out of bed but he does prop himself up against the pillow. The door slides open and Stark enters gracelessly, stumbling on the carpet and only just maintaining his balance. A dribble over his wrist and he swears colorfully in a language which might or might not be Russian. Loki is unable to withhold the chuckle he disguises as a cough. He stops quickly enough though. The movement hurts his face. Stark glares at him half-heartedly, but it's hard to be properly intimidated by the short little man who has food. He can smell it from here. He's gone without food before. Months at a time even when Thor was absent and Odin displeased, but he still feels the hunger. Just cannot die from it. And a bowl of thin porridge he'd been all too often unable to swallow isn't enough. The tray is set down on the edge of the bed. It holds a strange food. A large, pale circle indented by dark brown squares and swimming in rich, sticky sweetness. The coffee turns out to be a blackish bitter brew. He eyes it doubtfully. You know, if you don't want it, Stark says, reaching for a quarter of the circle. The motivation is enough. Loki snatches the plate away with his good arm, ignoring the egg and eyeing the cocky genius through narrowed eyes. The mortal has the audacity to grin. Loki looks downwards and selects a slice. It tastes good. Surprisingly good. He has to fight the impulse to wedge the whole lot inside his mouth, feeling suddenly more ravenous than he has in weeks. The coffee is better after he adds 8 cubes of sugar to it. You can't top the American waffle, Stark says with a fond sigh. Loki mentally scans through the plainer, more wholesome Asgardian fare of fruits and roast meats and honeyed everything. He can't disagree so he says nothing. You are still here, he observes after a moment or two, and suddenly he wonders if the food was some sort of trap and curses his stupidity in swallowing it without checking. Something of his panic must show because the mortal is raising a defensive hand suddenly and scooting backwards a little. Hey, don't go nuts on me, he says, I just want to plaster the arm. Couldn't think of a proper conversation jump. Loki doesn't unbend. My arm will heal on its own, he says dismissively. All the other breaks did. I don't even want to know how you know that, comes the swift return, but plaster hurts less, and it won't warp the limb. Won't warp the limb? Hurts less? Why do you even care? And come on, you can always just rip it off when it gets better anyway, Stark wheedles. And if I say no, you put up with my pushing and Cap giving you mournful looks until you're healed, comes the ready reply. He considers his options and finds only a vague confusion that his enemies care enough to push him at all. Thor obviously doesn't. If he had, he would have come when. But no, he burned that bridge himself, and it's stupid to whine like a child now because it's gone. He jerks himself out of his abstractions and reluctantly inclines his head, a gesture of defeat. Stark raises his fist in a victory gesture. He forces himself not to shrink back when the little mortal approaches because he can deal with him. Not a threat. But his heart rate accelerates and he's aware there's probably not much he can do against the mortal's technology. If you good to set the arm? Seemed fine with the ribs, Tony explains, because I'd be pleased, honestly, if we could avoid calling in a doctor. The less chance we have of S.H.I.E.L.D. finding out about this, the better. Loki wonders for the first time if he was kidnapped rather than transferred. He nods, more of a jerk than anything else. Hope flickers, faint as city stars. Like your PJs, the human grins. Tension doesn't fade, precisely, because he's twisting his arm into place with a chest full of broken ribs, and it hurts like it had when Thor had stuck Mjolnir on his chest. But it gives him something else to focus on. It reminds him of Tyr, in a way. Gruff, battle-hardened Tyr who didn't care enough about anything but war to feel jealous of Thor or Loki or Balder, and who gruffly talked about Thor's idiocy and pig-headedness whenever his older brother, not brother Loki supposed, needed to be cheered up when being patched up after a battle. Your choice, I assume? Loki retorts, only it's more of a groan. Hey, it's not my fault they were all that we could find in your size. All? I find that, he gasps as his arm slides into alignment. Find that hard to believe with your realm's predilection for mass-produced commodities. Who says predilection, rather than preference or taste? There's an obvious answer to that which I'm sure you'll find if you think hard enough. And then the plaster and the soothing, wet coldness is against his arm. You know, I'm not sure I'm flattered by that, Tony says, wrapping the white strands somewhat sloppily around the stiff arm. Loki fights the urge to flinch away as the calloused fingers brush against him. You should be. I gave you the credit of assuming you would realize eventually. Stark's lips twitch, still not a compliment, he says. And then he's done and is stepping away from the bed. Ribs good? He asks, picking up the remnants of the plaster and putting them on the tray. Yes, Loki lies. The man doesn't look convinced, but he shrugs. Doors unlocked if you feel like getting up. Jarvis'll give you directions if you get lost. The door opens automatically for him and clicks shut behind him. Loki is torn between wanting to rise and test the boundaries of what he can and cannot do and lying here for the next 4 hours trying not to shift a rapidly stiffening plaster mold while twitching the rest of his ribs back into place. He eventually opts for the latter. Half an hour later the door creaks open again, just as the last rib slides into place. It's Rogers. He's armed this time with a hefty box of something wedged firmly under his arm. Chess, the captain explains when Loki forces an eyebrow to twitch upwards. Chess, the captain confirms. Stark said he thought strategy was more your thing than just sitting here making awkward conversation. Loki feels wrong-footed somehow. It seems so surreal, so unbelievable, to think the men who caught him in Germany and watched him try to blow up their world are playing chess with him as though he's someone who matters. But there's still that look in the man's eyes. The one which says he'll take it like a kicked puppy if Loki knocks his offer back. He waits a second more, just to see what will happen. Rogers, predictably, starts apologizing. It's so much like Thor. Loki feels vaguely touched. I will play black, Loki says. He's rewarded by a wide smile and suddenly Rogers doesn't look quite so intimidating as he did. Chapter 3. Frenemyship. If Loki were to be honest with himself, he half expects Rogers to become annoyed and stop playing after he loses the first game. But Rogers just grins and challenges him to a rematch. It's odd. And yet strangely pleasant. He could, he thinks, get used to this. He certainly intends to try. Check, he says. It's game 3 and he has a queen in a castle and Rogers just has a king. It's entertaining watching Rogers try to dodge him, and he catches himself smiling whenever the little king gets backed one square closer to checkmate. Rogers is surprisingly good at this. No one ever took so many of his pieces back home. The king shifts one row closer to the edge. It will be over in 2 moves. Checkmate, he says. He likes winning. Rogers groans, but he flicks over his little white piece. You're good, he says, and he means it. Loki's grateful for the purple, puffy mask which is his face. It hides the sudden flush he's too weak to fight down. I am, he agrees, and grins at the super soldier's half-hearted glare. Or tries, anyway. It comes out more as a grimace. Are you all right? Yes? He tries, and then relents. He blames those achingly familiar blue eyes. Truth be told, I am sore, but I will heal. Even if he does not understand why they're helping him do so. He's considered this from almost every angle and he's useless without his magic. Completely and utterly useless. Especially when everyone knows he's a mass-murdering master manipulator. There is no work for him to do. No magical problems they need sorted. Nothing. And he knows from Asgard uselessness is a dangerous state to occupy. He supposes he should be suspicious, paranoid, even, but he can't summon up the energy just yet. Not when they actually seem to care about him and are holding out the promise of rising above the nothingness shield thrust him into. Later. Later he'll worry about motivations, not now. Another? He asks tentatively. Rogers grins. This time you're going down. He loses the next game within 20 minutes, applesauce. This time Loki does manage to get out a snicker. Afterwards, before he leaves, the super soldier pulls out a pen. Would you like me to sign the plaster? Sign the plaster? Loki echoes blankly. Yes. You know, hope you get well soon, and, thinking of you, that sort of thing. I could. His eyes light up. Paint a picture? Loki wonders if he's fully sane. Or not. Why? Loki produces. It's just something we do here. On Earth, I mean. At least in America. Just because then. He can deal with. Just because. Very well, Captain, he says. He spends the next hour chewing on a bowl of Cheerios the mortal was kind enough to fetch him while Rogers spreads green and brown and yellow splotches all up his plaster-clad arm. He signs the thing, best wishes for your recovery. Captain America. Loki decides he likes watching the man when he isn't busy eyeing him with that guilty look which says, I feel sorry for you because you're as bruised as a rotten apple. Stark pops in later and insists on signing the thing too. Only he signs it about 3 or 4 times. Something about filling in for missing friends. Loki hasn't the courage to tell them that. Pitiful as it is, they're it. Later that evening, when they've gone to bed, he traces the messages with one finger. There's a strange warmth inside him in a place which has been hollow for far too long. The morning sunlight spills through the window past the curtain, bathing the room in soft, yellow warmth. It might have lit up the room but there's already a lamp next to the bed. Dim and shaded but on. Steve had left it there, muttering something about finding the bathroom at night and tripping. Loki leaves it on all night. Illogical though it is, the light soothes him, keeps the shadows at bay. At some point he must have slept, because the pigeons are hooting outside and for a disoriented moment he doesn't know where he is. There's only the brightness and the hurting. And then he remembers and he can breathe again. He opens his pajama top to examine the morass of swollen flesh and purple bruises which is his stomach and chest. They hurt when he touches them, but they hurt less than they did. There's some dotted yellow intermingled with the purple now. It's good. His ribs have knitted a little now too. They no longer send agony lancing through him when he shifts. He wonders if he has Laufey or Odin to thank for his fast healing. The monstrous heritage or the golden apples? He decides he doesn't care. He hates both of them equally. Only that's not quite true. Laufey has had his quiet detestation and contempt. Odin, on the other hand. A sudden knocking jerks him out of his abstractions and he tugs up the duvet over his bare waist before he registers who it is. It's Stark bringing food again. He starts doing up the buttons, though it's frustratingly slow with just one hand. He wants him to go away. He also wants the waffles. Choices, but that's silly. He doesn't even know that's what the mortal is bringing. It might be porridge or more of that thin, disgusting gruel. Plan A, remaining silent and pretending not to be awake, is reluctantly abandoned. What is for breakfast? He calls. Waffles and coffee, Loki, waffles and coffee. It's the Stark staple, though I could rustle up a burnt omelet and toast if you got desperate for a change. It is waffles. But he is Loki. He does what he wants. He will not be constrained, not even by the demands of his stomach. I'm not hungry. It's a pathetic lie. Because he is. And he wants the food. But more, he wants to know how far he can press. Whether or not he has a choice. Whether they care enough to make him eat. He fights the urge to laugh, because there is no logic to these conflicting thoughts, and if he can't understand why he's doing this, then who is left? Perhaps he is mad. You sure? The disembodied voice queries. Yes, he lies. Because, you know, these will probably end up in the trash can if you don't eat them. The trash can. Manipulation. It's blatant and crude, and as objectionable as Thor's bad temper. The trash can. He opens his mouth to say so, and then another thought registers. Stark isn't entering. The realization is slow, like a very old candle fighting to burn against the damp. He won't enter because Loki hasn't let him in. He's rambling something about rats and dogs who really don't deserve such food and, oddly, something about children in Africa. He's trying to persuade, not force. Tyr would have pragmatically shrugged and left. Balder wouldn't have come at all. Thor would have brushed the doors aside by now and started practically force-feeding him. No one ever tries words. Loki finds himself swallowing his scathing insults back down, and he isn't sure why. Fine. Bring it in. I'll eat it, he says. He glares at the mortal for the rest of the meal because it's easier to be annoyed than face the little part of him that insists on being oddly touched. Stark, talking about weather, supermodels and Greece, doesn't seem to notice. Loki uncharitably decides it's because he's so fond of his own voice he probably babbles on for hours about nothing to no one anyway. Before he leaves, the mortal insists on signing the cast again. Tomorrow he'll send Stark away without letting him in. That day, Tony decides, marks the start of a somethingship. Friendship? Close. Frenemyship? Better. But arguably not a word. Their prickly, green-eyed guest still likes them to knock on the door at least twice before entering, and if he's feeling especially bitchy he'll send them away even then. Tony thinks he likes the power of saying yes and no again. He knew he had. Tony also works out that he'll open the door for Cheerios and waffles, and Steve, but not for toast or soup. Not that the latter occurs very often. Only on days when Pepper brings them over and tells him he should eat more healthily. He works out the demigod likes Pear's soap, but won't touch any of the citrus hand washes. He won't take his measurements either, but that's fine because he apparently knows them without checking. Tony pretends not to notice the way the suits or green silk pajamas hang off the thin frame at the start. It won't help, and the demigod's filling out rapidly enough so that in a couple of weeks they will fit. It's dinner time on day 4 when Loki leaves his room. Steve's made the mistake of asking Tony what he's working on, and he's just launched into what promises to be a dinner-long monologue about thrusters and stabilizers when he hears, from behind him, a smooth, snide voice ask, "Don't you ever tire of the sound of your own voice?" Tony jerks around because is it even safe for Loki to be up yet? And then he notices it, or rather the absence of it. "Your cast's gone," he says. "You're up," Steve says from next to him. "Indeed. I did warn you my arm would not take long to heal." "Yeah, but seriously? There's 4 days and there's soon. I was thinking more like a couple of weeks." Loki looks vaguely flattered. His face is not swollen anymore, and if it's pale and waxy, well, Tony's the last person to throw stones about looking like shit after torture. "You should sit down," Steve says, rising and pulling out a chair. "I'm not an invalid. They're green-eyed guest objects, more amused than offended if that thin smile is anything to go by. But you would like some pasta and sauce, right? Miss Potts brought it over. She cooked it herself and it's better than cheeseburgers." "It is not," Tony objects. Steve's lips twitch. "Should I tell Miss Potts that?" "Bastard." Tony sulks, poking a fork at him. "All right, it's up there, with the cheeseburger." Loki makes his way over to the seat and sits down. "I shall try some of this pasta and sauce," he announces. "Way to go, Tiger. Plates are in the left cupboard on the middle shelf." "You would not obtain one for me?" the demigod asks, pasting on a deliberately pathetic look. Tony shovels in another mouthful of the dinner and says around it, "Who was it who said he wasn't an invalid?" Loki redirects the appealing look towards Steve. The super soldier, Tony realizes 3 seconds later, may have an incredibly advanced metabolism and maybe weighs stronger than the average strongman, but when it comes to resisting manipulation he's disgustingly bottom class. He rises and fetches the now smiling trickster a bowl and a fork. "Softy," Tony quips as said man moves past and plonks them down in front of their guest. "Just because some people are gentlemen," Loki says, ladling himself out a generous helping of the meal. Steve looks pleased. Tony rolls his eyes. "Honestly, some people." That evening, after they've dumped everything inside the dishwasher, Loki turns to go upstairs again. Tony blames the vaguely wistful look on that overly expressive face for his next words. "Do you want to watch a movie with us? Movie? You know, colorful series of moving pictures generally depicting a not totally unbelievable narrative?" "I see," he says, but a telling crease in his forehead betrays him. "Well?" Loki's eyes flick between him and Steve and whatever he sees there prompts him to say. "Very well." Tony lets Steve pick because he's not sure if porn and blood are totally their thing. That and well, while he'd like to watch classic kids movies, dignity prevents him from picking them. Sure enough, Steve goes with the cartoons and they settle down to enjoy Beauty and the Beast. It's actually strange, in a way, to see the green eyes so conflictingly blank and yet totally absorbed. No insanity. No guarded wariness. Just the occasional snicker at some of Gaston's more obnoxious lines. Odd too to see Captain America laughing at Cogsworth and Lumiere. They're yawning by the end of it, but after it's over, when Steve has said it was very touching and well done and Tony's still humming snatches of verse, Loki says he is glad the Beast's beastliness was just a curse. That Belle showed remarkable fortitude for falling in love with a monster. That's all, but it sends warning bells rattling inside Tony's skull and he files it away for later consideration. They get a call from S.H.I.E.L.D. a couple of days later saying that a dangerous prisoner has escaped custody, and they can tell from Fury's face he's suspicious, but Hill says the records are clear and the prisoner escaped 2 days after their visit. Tony sends Hill a box of chocolates she's probably too healthy to eat. But hey, it's the thought that counts, right? They spend a week searching for magical signatures with someone called Dr. Strange, but Loki hasn't used any and so they don't find any. Strange concludes the demigod realm hopped. Fury talks again about getting ready, but it's somehow a whole lot less convincing than before. Chapter 4. It's hard to say whose fault it is that there is another movie night the next evening, and the evenings after that. Tony personally blames Steve. Mainly because it's the super soldier who suggests first Monsters Inc., then Toy Story, and him who has to point out it's important to see Star Wars, the real 3, before the movie can make proper sense. It's a success. Loki even enjoys Monsters Inc., though he says Sully and Waternoose are as bad as Thor and Odin and, in a moment of candor, Randall as bad as himself. And when Tony laughs at everyone goes to lunch, the trickster laughs with him. By the third night it's become something of a tradition. Enough so that Tony actually programs Jarvis to prepare the popcorn by 8 and makes sure he doesn't leave the new laser half on when he ducks upstairs for dinner. He even stops getting drunk for them, sometimes. The first thing he tells them before sticking in Star Wars is that it is a movie, just in case the real actors throw them. Movies did exist in the 40s, Steve responds dryly. "I'm not an idiot. I know it's fake," is Loki's ungrateful answer. And so he's not really prepared for Loki to go rigid at, "No, Luke. I'm your father." Sure, it sucked to find out Vader was your dad, but Luke's life has sucked in a lot of ways before this. And though they've had heated debates about whether or not Ben could have saved Owen and Beru if he'd been there, no one has actually overreacted to anything. Reacted, yes, but not like this. "You alright?" he murmurs. He has to say it again before he gets a response. And then it's only a quick glance and a nod that's more a jerk than anything else. But there are so many emotions swirling in those green depths. Anger. Envy. Pain. There are more and he can't even begin to decipher them because he doesn't know a damn thing about why they're there. They end up watching both episodes because no one wants to leave Han stuck in the carbonite. Afterwards, Loki silently holds out his own tumbler when Tony pours himself a scotch. It's a bad precedent to drink away troubles, and he knows that better than most people. But he pours it anyway. Stones in glass houses, and all that. 2 glasses later and he's feeling safe enough to remark, idly, that it's odd no one changed Luke's last name if they didn't want his dad finding him. Yes, Steve agrees, and why didn't they leave him with a less obvious relative? Maybe his father didn't care enough about him to look for him, Loki says, nursing his 3rd glass of the rich liquid. Maybe his father left him. The words are raw and bitter and everything and then screams abandonment complex. Tony suddenly remembers Thor saying his brother was adopted. You were adopted, weren't you? And Tony's pleased that it's Steve who says it and not him. Did you ever meet your real family? There's a long moment of silence, and he's thinking shit, because the green eyes are so very cold. Yes, Loki says at last. He swallows the rest of his glass in one gulp. Not fun? The genius asks. Not especially. Tony fills up his glass again. And his own. They drop the subject and return to safer waters. That night he racks his brain to think of movies where adopted children were remotely happy. Stuart Little, The Blind Side, Lilo and Stitch. Does that even count? He wonders just how bad Loki's real family was. Whether he hurt them. Whether they hurt him. He shouldn't be thinking about this. He shouldn't. He should focus on the things he can control. Not things which probably happened however many centuries ago and which are none of his business anyway. It's a long time before he gets to sleep that night. When Loki trots down for breakfast the next morning, Stark isn't there. Just Rogers, who has, spread before him, an empty bowl, 3 rolls, a platter of waffles and a bottle of water. Your appetite is admirable. All you need is roast boar and mead and you'd fit right into Asgard, Loki says, pulling out a plate of his own. He wants waffles. He can smell them from here and the original plan of Cheerios with milk simply isn't appetizing by comparison. He doesn't ask for the captain's. It's undignified to beg in anyways. Stark told him yesterday to just put the pre-mixed batter inside the metallic contraption and flick the on switch. Apparently the thing is automated. Rogers sighs. It's the serum. It increases my metabolism. I'm hungry all the time now. Essence of Volstagg, Loki says with a quick grin. The captain doesn't look like he gets the joke. He opens the fridge and brushes aside an assortment of old soups and older mounds of fuzzy green somethings which might once have been food. The batter is on the top shelf, of course, in the open, and he glares at it when he finally spots it. You know, the captain says, if you want some of these ones. I'm perfectly capable of preparing my own food, he says dismissively. He doesn't need the mortal's pity or his scraps. Where is Stark? He asks, turning the subject. He said something about having a date with Hill about S.H.I.E.L.D., the captain replies. Oh, he tries to ignore the way his treacherous, weak body starts shaking. Doesn't risk looking at Rogers. He needs to focus. Unscrewing the lid of the batter mixture, he pours some into the waffle iron. They aren't going to hand him back over to Fury. They have no motive. He's been so careful about not giving them a motive. He said he wanted to see if Fury was. That is to say, if it was only you or other decisions. Only me, he echoes. I mean, if it's other decisions too, we'd like to know about them. And we'd like to know how many other people know about them. It's just, mistreatment of war prisoners is something soldiers get fired for because their superiors didn't know. We need more than that if we want to get him into rehab or replaced. Replace him? You want to demote Fury over his treatment of me? He's looking at the captain now, searching for any sign of dishonesty in those determined, guileless blue eyes. Yes. Being honest, I don't like serving people I can't trust, and I can't trust a commander who'd order or condone what he did to you. He's clenching his fingers on the handle of the steel contraption cooking his breakfast, and he's distantly aware the extra pressure is making it burn. This is something which is supposed to happen after months of quiet manipulation. They aren't supposed to do this so soon because they're not supposed to care. No one cares what happens to him unless they're Thor. And Thor only rescues him. He never prevents it from happening again. But, it was fair. My sentence, he protests weakly, not quite certain why. It's the price I paid for murdering your kind. Rogers has that strange look on his face. The one he wore when Loki first woke, which he's starting to suspect might be horrified pity. You actually believe that? He can't hold that searing gaze. The floor is so much easier to face. Yes. No. Does it matter? The Allfather is just. The Queen always said there was a purpose to everything he did. The words are bare. They are the doubts which have followed him through the months. Years. Emotions swinging like a pendulum between hatred for allowing everything and desperation for some shred of forgiveness, some promise that he can return to his not family in his not home and have everything like it was before he realized he was a monster. Back when he'd thought there was a way he would eventually find which could make things okay. Your father knew about this? Loki turns his attention to the burning waffle and methodically unhooks the cooker, scraping out the blackened thing which he has produced. I assumed you were aware of his involvement. We knew he'd handed you over to Fury. We didn't know he knew about what Fury did to you. Oh, and his voice is suddenly very small. He just let it happen, the mortal persists. He made the collar. And he has Heimdall. The ravens. He knows. That's Rogers breaks off. His chair creaks and SRDS. Loki fights the urge to turn and finishes scraping out the metal contraption. He can't get all the bits out. Can't seem to do anything right today. Is that why you haven't asked us to take the collar off? He's closer now. Loki does turn then. He puts the iron in the dishwasher. The captain is barely a couple of meters away and he has to remind himself that he's not trapped. This is a friend. Or not an enemy, anyway. One who is wearing blue socks with red stars. Would you have done so? Truly, I am a murderer and a liar and a monster. Would you give me the means to harm you? To destroy your world again? I did not ask because there is only one sane answer to the question. Rogers stands his ground. You aren't a monster, Loki. He doesn't argue with the liar and murderer part, or disagree about the collar. Loki feels an insane urge to laugh because of course the soldier doesn't know. He doesn't even know if Thor knows the truth yet, so of course Rogers doesn't know. I am a monster. Do you know what I am? I am not Acer. Not even human. I am a frost giant. A Jotun. My father left me to die because I was a worthless runt and I wasn't any more pleasing to the Allfather when he adopted me. He can't seem to stop the words from spewing out. Do you know what it is to be truly despised? To know when others lie. Know that whenever people talk to you they are wishing they were talking so somebody else or even no one. To know when you aid your brothers they will say that your best efforts are mere trickery because your strongest weapon is magic. To be ordered to know your place and to be silent whenever you speak out of turn when others are listened to and encouraged. Asgard knew I was a monster long before I did. He's panting now and he's aware he probably looks deranged. So do not tell me I am no monster, for I am one. First by blood, then by choice. He's shaking and he doesn't know why. All he wants is to slip past Rogers and crawl underneath his duvet for a year or two and not have to face anything like his not father and shield again. The socks are approaching. I can't say I do. No, but I wasn't like this before the serum. I remember when I applied for the army, I wanted to defend the home. You know, they knocked me back. I had the same qualifications as a 90-year-old. But then I wasn't alone. He breaks off and Loki risks glancing up. The blue eyes are clouded with remembered pain. So no, I don't know what it's like to be truly despised, but I know what it's like to be pitied because all I was wasn't enough for anything. In a way I kind of admire you. Tony said once, when we first met, that everything I was came out of a bottle. To be fair, I'd implied he wasn't much without the suit. But it's true, if it weren't for the serum I'd be a 90-pound weakling with asthma. And dead from old age, but that's beside the point. You managed to overcome your weaknesses. I can't say I appreciated the use to which you put your strength, but it is there. And for a poor fighter you have a mean swing. They stay there for a while, staring in silence which is strangely not awkward. Then Rogers stretches out a hand slowly and rests it on his upper arm. It's light enough so that he could probably break free as he wanted to, so while he stills he doesn't try to jerk away. It's nice. You're not a monster. You're just Darth Vader, he produces. It's so ridiculous that Loki snorts. But he can feel his tension easing. If he cannot yet accept that he isn't a monster he can at least accept that he isn't to the captain. Looking back, it's then that Rogers becomes Steve. Tony can't say he's enjoying his lunch, especially. For a start, both he and Hill are in disguise, which in her case means a wig, a dress and a lot of thick makeup, and in his means a cheap suit and dark sunglasses. Secondly, the food is late, cold and expensive. He puts up with it though, because Hill chose the dingy little club and according to her no one here is particularly interested in anyone else's business. He brought a certain nondescript suitcase anyway, just in case. He makes small talk over the wine, which has most definitely been watered down. She's tense. He knows the signs. A certain care when discussing things which don't matter. A tightness about the eyes. So, he says once the meal's arrived, wrestling with a gristly steak, I guess what I'm asking is, does Fury's new attitude go deeper? And is he doing to anyone else anywhere else what he did to you know who? Define deeper, Stark. Honestly, decisions which endanger agents. Careless mistakes. Other people being tortured the way 67 was. Weapons, like the Mark II, in enemy hands. Latveria on the shipment's lists. And okay, those last two are a little pointed. She's silent for a moment. I'm afraid I can't help you, Stark. My loyalty is with S.H.I.E.L.D., she says. He wants to ask her why the hell she agreed to meet him here, but he's always been smart, and though he rarely employs it, he does have a brain-to-mouth filter. I'm sorry, Tony, she says, and then she's rising to go and she's holding a hand out for him to shake. Take care of the check, will you? Sure, he says impatiently, shaking her hand. Behind the shades his eyes widen as something small and cold slips into his palm. Then she's gone, heels clicking and peroxide blonde hair bouncing as she makes her way through the crowd. Straight face. Keep a straight face, he tells himself as he watches her leave, but he's smiling a little as he slips the data stick into his pocket. He tips the club 200 before he leaves. Fury, just what are you hiding? Chapter 5 Loki ends up sharing the captain's waffles, largely because there don't seem to be any spare waffle irons. They spend a passable morning discussing Star Wars because movies are all they really have in common without risking the pit traps they don't know each other well enough to avoid. Steve seems to pick up on that about 20 minutes after him. They've finished breakfast now, and Loki's leaning back in his chair trying not to think about Stark and S.H.I.E.L.D. and feeling full. The super soldier is chewing on an apple. That's when the captain decides to cross into more dangerous territory. Have you ever tried reading the paper or watching the news? I'm afraid understanding Midgardian culture wasn't my top priority during the period on Midgard I was free. Steve frowns and it belatedly occurs to Loki that subject probably isn't a laughing matter. No, I don't suppose it was. Pit trap number 1. Though if I were interested in the news, I don't think I'd read the paper. If I recall correctly, Barton mentioned computers were the main way one kept track of information in this realm. And again it's squarely his fault for floundering into pit trap number 2. Clint. Oh. Yes, that's right, I suppose. Unforgivably careless of him to bring up the fact he'd mind-dominated one of the captain's friends. It seems his tongue has truly turned to lead today. The conversation has descended into stilted awkwardness. He abandons it in favor of staring off absently at nothing. Loki, unlike Steve, who apparently intends to plow onwards anyway. Why did you do it? Invade us, kill Coulson? And not just fail to sidestep the pitfalls but actively leap into them. Coulson, he stalls. Thor said he was threatening you with a rather large gun, the soldier supplies helpfully, and now Loki remembers him, vaguely. He wonders whether, if he remains silent, the mortal will abandon his line of questioning. Why? Apparently not. He was in the way. I didn't know what the gun did. He challenged my conviction. He was defending Thor. He suspects of them all the last, and by extension the first, are true. And since he is a monster, why should he care if he sounds like one? Only, Steve doesn't yet think he is. Loki? He supposes the captain deserves the truth. Or as close a version to it as he is prepared to give. He tries not to sound much of anything when he replies. I invaded your world because I needed the Tesseract. My allies were not kind. Nor, when one crosses him, is the Allfather. Handing over the Tesseract, the lost jewel of Asgard's treasury, to the Chitauri. I knew I would need somewhere safe when my act was discovered, and barring Thor's banishment we hadn't visited here for over 1,000 years. It was the logical place to take, for the Tesseract was already here. No one looked for me during the years after and I didn't think the Allfather cared enough about me to bother anymore. I didn't think he knew yet. And then Thor came, demanding that I just drop it all and return home because Asgard mourned. Mourned? If anyone had asked Heimdall they would have known I was alive. I just wanted to hurt him after that, I think. Coulson was just someone else in the way. His voice is still flat and emotionless when he finishes, and he's absurdly proud of the fact. He manages to force himself to look up at the captain at the end. No excuses. No justification. No mention of those endless weeks of falling to nothing. No Loki, no mention of his broken, battered waking on frozen Jotunheim, or the hastily woven lies, all that stood between him and a tortuous death. Fear. No mention of his capture by the Chitauri as he practiced world walking. Helpless. Pain. Screaming. Let the mortal judge him as he will. He refuses to care. The captain looks oddly pale. Or perhaps it is not so odd. The queen used to pale whenever she was especially disgusted by anything. Nothing personal then. Only with Thor, Loki agrees. He wishes he hadn't answered now. Loki? He doesn't say anything this time. I'm not going to pretend I think what you did was okay. But you know, for the record, just because your actions, killing Coulson, demanding we kneel, making Clint try to kill us, disgust me doesn't mean you do. You? Why not? What am I but the sum of every mistake I've ever made? Because you don't. That answer is Thorishly obscure. Loki says so. Steve shrugs. If I was going to be disgusted by you, I'd have to be disgusted by half the Avengers. It's not really my place to say, but none of us have stellar pasts. I'd have to be disgusted by me too. I was just a performing monkey who couldn't even save the man who transformed me from a 90-pound weakling into this. I smashed an entire bar to pieces when I couldn't drink away Bucky's death. So no, I'm not disgusted by you. What you choose to do with your strength, maybe, but not you. But, and besides, the captain persists, I can't hate someone who agrees with me that Han Solo acts a bit like Tony. Meaningless. The words are meaningless. And yet, a lifetime of ARGR whispered behind his back and he is comforted by this. He gets up from the table then and begins putting the dishes away in the dishwasher. The cereal away in the cupboard. Anything to distract him from the slight tingling in his eyes. If Steve notices, he's kind enough to pretend not to. Home or Pepper? That's the question, of course, and Tony finds himself considering it when Happy asks where he would like to be dropped off. On the one hand, home has better security. On the other hand, Pepper is Pepper. And if the sort of information on the stick is anything other than video footage or photos, there's no one he'd trust more to help him trawl through it. Especially if it's economics. It probably will be economics. Pepper it is. Stark Industries, he says. And if he's lucky he'll be able to change into a better suit while he's waiting for her. One which doesn't stink of the club and stale wine from where the waiter slipped up filling his glass. He is lucky. According to Susan, the current secretary, Pepper is apparently at a conference and, not only that, keeps a whole closet of spare suits in there for him. Rolling up drunk one too many times has its advantages, it seems. He changes into a dark gray suit which isn't scratchy and doesn't smell of cheap perfume and stale tobacco smoke. Or at least, he decides he'll tell himself it was tobacco the spaced-out trio in the corner were smoking. Then he sits down and waits for Pepper. And waits, and waits. There's a reason he never used to attend those interminable meetings when he could avoid it. At some point he pulls out his iPhone and entertains himself with looking himself up on Google. It's amazing, really, that so many gossip columnists don't seem to think he's really in love with Pepper. Loki suggests playing chess in the lounge room in the afternoon for two reasons. The one he offers is that it is a pleasant occupation and Steve doesn't have any emergencies to be in anyway, does he? The more honest reason, of course, is that strategically Stark must pass this room to go to either his bedroom or his workshop. And he fully intends to waylay him when he does. In the interim, the game will do to pass the time. 2 hours later he is restless. It's almost dinner now, so why isn't the mortal back yet? He excuses himself abruptly from the fourth game and rises, pacing back and forth. And for all he reminds himself of a caged wildcat he cannot bring himself to stop. You look tense. He shoots an impatient look at the captain. How observant of you. Tony will be fine, you know. He would have called us by now if anything was wrong. Called you, perhaps. And I am not worrying about Stark. Steve's lips quirk upwards. I'm not. I am mildly concerned as to his present whereabouts. It is an entirely different thing to worrying. I never said you were, the soldier says, I just said he's probably fine. Probably. Probably. Besides, the man continue. Loki knows he is right. There are too many logical reasons for S.H.I.E.L.D. not to attack Stark for the possibility to become reality. And yet he continues his restless movements. How can he say that he is concerned about himself? That his care is purely selfish and not noble to the least degree? That he wonders if Hill is a traitor? He's never met her so he doesn't know. What if they suspect he is here and use Stark to find him? What if they arrest him and take him back? His Acer sentence may be served but he doubts the mortals will care for that. He knows far too little about this entire situation and it bothers him more than he can describe. As the mortals say, knowledge is power, and he has always hated being powerless. Mirrors. Brightness. Fear. Pain. Steve is talking and he cannot bring himself to care what the soldier is saying. Frost giant. The word jerks him out of his abstractions like being doused with cold mead. What? The captain flushes apologetically. Sorry about that. You looked like you were having a panic attack. Oh really? And saying, Frost giant, helped, did it? Well, it got your attention. Repeated, are you okays didn't seem to be working. And now it's his turn to flush. Oh. There are a few moments of silence and it occurs to him that he must look rather silly just standing there doing nothing. Are you okay? Steve says. Repeats, probably. To lie or not to lie? Yes, he says flatly and continues to pace. You know, having flashbacks isn't something to be ashamed of. The super soldier hazards, with uncanny insight, it's a side effect of experiencing trauma. Most people wouldn't even be up yet if they'd been through what you'd been through. I am not most people. He isn't even a person. I'm just saying it's not something you need to run from. I've seen soldiers fall apart trying to bottle everything inside, trying to pretend they were fine. You think I am falling apart, do you? He demands, suddenly angry. It's irrational and pathetic, and what if he is? I'm just saying you aren't alone. If you want to talk about anything, I'll listen. It is so ludicrous that he laughs, sharp and bitter. And you would know what it is to be helpless, of course. To know that it is your fault and that you are too weak to change that which you most hate. Steve stiffens and Loki shakes his head derisively, but then the mortal is speaking. I wasn't tortured, unless you count being beaten up in every back alley in Brooklyn. But being helpless. Flashbacks. I remember men dying when we were fighting Hydra. It was. One moment they were yelling and running and then just nothing. Not even dust or a body. Like they'd never even existed. And Bucky. Steve breaks off and suddenly Loki half wishes he hadn't asked. The man's voice is under control, flat, when he finally finishes. He was hanging there and I couldn't reach. I was stretching out and he was so scared. The rail broke, and he fell. Somehow Loki is aware he is seated back on the couch, feeling surprisingly small. I fell. I'm sorry, he offers, it isn't your fault. And he knows that. He does. But there is plenty which is. Part of him wants to reassure the captain like the mortal had him that morning. Wonders if placing a hand on his shoulder would help. But he was the enemy who almost toppled the world, not a friend. More deeply, there is a part of him which feels sick at the idea of seeking out contact. And so he stays on his seat and just tries to look sympathetic. He doesn't know if it helps or not, but the haunted look on the soldier's face fades after a few minutes anyway. It's fine, the man says. I had Peggy to talk me through my breakdown. Peggy? A girl I met in the army. Decked a fellow for disrespect when I first met her. I would have married her, I think, if I hadn't been buried in the ice. Loki is silent. Steve looks small again. He doesn't know what to say. I was married once. I tricked her into it for a joke. We didn't love each other and she left me. How pathetic. A mockery of everything real. Like the rest of him, he supposes, he remains silent. The captain squares his jaw and smiles firmly. But it's over now. She'd be the first person to tell me not to waste my life with regrets. Look, I'm not trying to pressure you into anything. I guess all I'm saying is that I know from experience that sometimes it feels better letting it out. Loki sighs. I will consider it, and, Steve, thank you. For understanding. For not minding when I lash out. For not calling me weak. For telling me about Bucky and Peggy. The mortal nods and offers him a quick smile, then. Do you want to finish our game? Yes, ooh. Pepper is sitting next to him in an obscure office. Tony's got a laptop. One with a highly secure private server. It would take him 3 hours and the rest of humanity 3 years to hack, he hopes. The innocuous little stick, gray, mundane and labeled, recipes, is plugged in and, shit, just shit. Latveria weapons shipments. And while the standard issue handguns might be planned, those Mark II prototypes and the warheads which just happened to go missing en route around the same time an anonymous donor happened to give a donation of almost exactly what they were worth. Well, he doesn't believe in coincidences. And neither, going by the highlighted relevant information, does Hill. And it isn't only Latveria, Iraq, North Korea. There are agents missing in action too, all older men and women. And from the highlighted parts of their files, they were also all close friends of Fury. Shit. Tony, just how differently has Fury been acting? Pepper asks. He's told her, of course, about Loki. She hadn't been especially pleased. He threw you out a window, but she hasn't told anyone, so he's counted that a plus. Just like a more intense, creepy version of his normal self, he says, but he understands the underlying question. His eyes aren't blue, Pep, she frowns. Contacts? I'm pretty sure S.H.I.E.L.D. is smart enough to spot a wearing contacts blue-eyed Fury. And he is moderately certain of that. You don't need to be a genius to check for them. So what do you think, Pep? We got enough here to call him up? She wrinkles her nose thoughtfully. It depends on whether or not S.H.I.E.L.D. is licensed to trade with Latveria and Iraq. The stolen shipments are probably just circumstantial evidence, she says at last, but Tony, I'm worried. What if they decide you're the next James Ferris? She points to a wrinkled baldy labeled, deceased. I'm Iron Man, he protests. Tony, I'll be careful. She doesn't look entirely reassured. He wonders if that's Obi's fault. Or Loki's. Or Vanko's. Or his. I will, he repeats. All right, Tony. But let me look into the legal agreements S.H.I.E.L.D. has before you go ahead with this, won't you? We need to be sure. All right, he says easily, but what are the odds I could persuade you to do it at home instead of here? He says, waggling his eyebrows suggestively. The odds, as it transpires, are high. Pepper accompanies him back that very night. Chapter 6. When he finally gets home with Pepper, it's a little after 9. It's the fault of the peak traffic combined with the decision, I'm hungry, Pepper, to stop in at Sam's Diner for an hour or two, a neat little place which cooks the best gristle-free roast in New York. They stay there longer than they probably should because they haven't had a proper date for over a week. Tony does feel a twinge of guilt when they walk into the lounge room and he sees the time though. Honestly, he hadn't intended to make Steve wait that long. Or, going by that tense, pale face, Loki. When they get a private moment he's going to have a word or two with the captain about secret keeping and the advantages thereof. You're back, Steve says, turning off the news and giving them a smile. No, I'm a ghost, Tony deadpans. At least Loki grins. He decides to ham it up. The Force will be with you, Loki. Always, he intones in his best Alec Guinness voice. Loki opens his mouth, either for a return quote or to insult his accent. Tony never does find out because suddenly Pepper's stepped forwards, heels clicking, and he's thinking he probably should have remembered to tell her the infamous Asgardian was up and about. You're Loki? She says. To be fair, the demigod perched stiffly on the edge of the couch looks dressed to go to college. He doesn't, in the gray t-shirt and dark slacks, look like a recently tortured and rescued supervillain. But maybe that's just the lack of rictus grins, wounds and leather. I am, he admits cautiously, and you are? Pepper Potts. Being fair, Loki, which other beautiful women would I bring home at this hour? I can. Tony can too. You know, on second thoughts, don't answer that. The demigod's grin is very wide and very insincere. Very well, Stark. Since you insist. And then the smile vanishes. Pepper has left Tony's side and is bearing down on the unfortunate demigod with deadly intent. To his credit he stands his ground. Or maybe not, Tony mentally amends, noting positions and performing some basic arithmetic. He'd have to leap the couch to get away, trapped then. You threw Tony out a window, Pepper says, pointing a finger at the towering Asgardian. Loki blinks, eyes darting about for escape. And then he swallows, dropping his gaze to the carpet, apparently unable to meet her gaze. I did, he says, I am most sorry for the act, Lady Pepper. I was. Not myself at the time. It is not something I intend to repeat. And suddenly, Tony knows Loki must have gotten away with a hell of a lot more than he should have as a kid. He doesn't look like however many thousand years old he probably is. He doesn't even look 30. And, are his eyes watering? I have nephews, you know, Pepper says dryly. The jade eyes snap up to hers, wide. I'm sure they are charming beings if they are related to you, he offers. Steve, still seated off to the side, lets out an undignified snort. The face is great. But Reindeer Games, you need to work on your sincerity, Tony says. A shadow of something like regret flits across Loki's face. It's gone so fast Tony can't be sure that it was ever there. You are right, of course. But really, Stark. Reindeer Games? Are you not a little old for that sort of humor? You're saying no one's ever called you on the horns? I mean, how are they even practical? Loki flushes. They were enchanted not to encumber me. Intimidation, not defense, was their primary function, he says stiffly. Sure. Reindeer Games, Tony grins. Loki huffs and crosses his arms over his chest. Pepper looks back and forth between them, brow furrowed. The demigod looks back at her after a moment or two. For what it's worth, I am sorry, he offers. She raises an eyebrow. I would be with S.H.I.E.L.D. still if it were not for Stark and Steve. I do not hurt my friends intentionally when I have them. Tony finds himself wondering why he's still Stark if Steve's Steve. But it seems to be enough for Pepper. And if she still looks a bit suspicious, there's a lot less hostility to it than before. She nods and returns to him with a muttered, well, if you're sure about this Tony. Which, since he is awesome. It's always nice when Pepper supports his goals. And her face is really quite pretty when she gets annoyed and flushes like that. Wait, is that Loki talking? What I said, was Hill informative? His face is calm but his left hand is mangling his trouser leg. Tony wonders if he's even picked up that he's doing it. Yep. Very. And then he decides to be a bastard, just because he can. So Steve, how was your day? Steve's day, apparently, consisted of chess, talking, eating, jogging and breaking another 3 punching bags. By the time he's finished saying so, well, if the flared nostrils and narrowed eyes of a certain demigod are anything to go by it'd be best, Tony thinks, not to pick a seat near the trickster when he eventually sits down. Sounds like it wasn't much fun, Tony says sympathetically when the super soldier reaches the end of his litany. It might surprise you to learn just how many people enjoy exercise and a relaxing day at home. Tony shudders. March of the oddballs, and you don't even drink coffee. It's the serum. I can't get drunk either. You know, fascinating as this is, would it be too much for you to save this until after you tell me what you found out from Agent Hill? He blinks. You mean, Tony, Pepper interjects. Alright. The info, Tony says, pulling out the laptop from a suitcase. Loki shoots the redhead a grateful look. It's 10:30 by the time they've finished trawling through the information. Loki decides he doesn't dislike Miss Pepper Potts. It's partly because she doesn't seem to mind him being dishonest and partly because she isn't trying to pretend she likes him. But mostly it's because when she makes Stark, Steve and herself some hot chocolate after they've finished examining the information, she makes him one too. Grand gestures are common in all Asgard. Perhaps that is why he finds the little ones mean so much more to him. They are all 4 of them sitting around holding the warm and strangely pleasant drinks, and Stark is keeping well out of pranking distance. Pity. Not that it will help him. Loki fully intends to have his revenge eventually on the mortals teasing. But right now, the majority of his thought is devoted to the conundrum that is S.H.I.E.L.D. So what you're saying is Fury's been dealing with borderline enemies above the tables and open enemies below them, Steve says. Someone certainly has been, Stark not quite agrees. Who else could it be? Mystique for one, Cap. There aren't exactly a shortage of shapeshifters around. Mystique. Who is Mystique? Loki asks. One of the X-Men. Hot. Blue skin with a scaly patterned look. She can wear forms like I wear clothes. You mortals find blue skin attractive? Hell yeah. You seen Avatar? I have to show you Avatar. Some random guy in the news was saying he'd never marry because there was a shortage of blue female giants around. Not that Mystique's a giant. Loki finds himself swallowing. Steve coughs sharply. But yeah, back on topic. Fury's old friends seem to be having lethally bad luck. Anyone else thinks that screams, I'm not me. Steve frowns thoughtfully. All his old friends, you say? Well, a lot of them. Going by the files. The ones which aren't dead from old age. That's certainly suspicious, but I'm sensing but here, Cap. Well, these things usually take months, years even, in the planning stages. And how long has this gone on for? 3 months, Potts says decisively. Exactly. It's moving too fast. Why? Tony shrugs. Does it matter? Obi was an overnight job. Maybe he just snapped. Someone got too close, saw too much, and he decided to just wing it. Obi, Fury. No, I meant, who's Obi? Steve clarifies. Ah, Stark rubs the back of his neck. Short version, friend of my dad's who thought in Nice for his plans of running the company. Didn't work out that way, he died. Loki doesn't miss the way Potts stretches out her hand and rests it on Stark's or the way he squeezes it back. But Barton had told him about this, he recalls. Something about a lying father figure, torture in a different province, and the arc reactor. He is less surprised than he should be to feel a faint vein of sympathy for the mortal. And what makes you think that Fury is not simply eliminating those less likely to agree with his methods and replacing them with less moralistic agents? He asks. Steve at least looks thoughtful, Stark, not so much. Because he wasn't like this. He was like Coulson. Sure, he'd endorse threatening to, and I quote, tase me and watch, super nanny, while I drool into the carpet. But actual torture? Like he deserves everything he's getting, actual torture? No information. No purpose but revenge? Way I see it, Fury doesn't suck that badly. He said that? Potts gasps, day we rescued him. I will destroy him. And I will make him pray for death before the end. No, beg for it. Loki, Steve says, tentative. There's a sharp pain in his palms and he suddenly realizes there are bloody half-circles there where his nails have dug into his flesh. He straightens his fingers out slowly, forcing the tension, the hatred, back down. He needs to think. Needs to stay focused. I am fine. Surprisingly, it's Stark who seems to see through the lie. But the man doesn't comment. He merely throws a skeptical look in his direction. So you think somewhere between Loki being defeated and, well, now, Fury got replaced, Steve says? Well, it fits. But did it? This entire brand of logic felt too smooth, too easy. It was like being herded towards an unseen pen. No clear way to go but onwards. Running and running but in the wrong direction and no escape. What's his motive though? The super soldier frowns, why now? Whoever's replacing him had to know that he was close friends with Coulson. Hell, probably with a couple odd hundred of the people who died. It'd be a neat enough excuse, mental strain, to slip in a missed shipment here, a missing agent there. Gets them their weapons, no questions asked. Maybe more than that with time. Loki takes a sip of his drink, fingers clenching about the cup. Convenience then, he remarks lightly, but who performed the replacement? Dunno, Stark shrugs. Doom? Hydra? Terrorists? Could be any of them. Not really our problem. We just want fake Fury out and real Fury, and if he's, not dead. And if he is? Loki asks, feeling something. A good replacement. He'll, most likely. Or if not, someone else the council trusts. Someone else the council trusts. So what we need to do, Steve says, is get some more proof of what Fury is doing. Get him arrested. And get S.H.I.E.L.D. back to being controlled by a decent director. Something like that, Tony agrees. Something like that. Something like that. And suddenly the events click into place. Is it not fortunate that I happened to be being tortured so badly as I was? If not, no one would ever have thought of investigating and replacing your director, Loki says blandly. 3 sets of eyes snap toward his face. Loki. He doesn't care which of them said it. It is exactly as you said, Captain. They moved too fast. Far too fast. One never moves that fast when one wants to succeed. So, why? His eyes are glittering as he stares at each of them in turn. Perhaps I should say, as you do, idiocy and carelessness are to blame. But I do not. I say Fury is terribly, terribly shrewd. There was no motive for what they did to me. No questions asked. Nothing better than petty revenge in any of your scenarios. Loki, I don't think, exactly. You do not think. I do. I have fought wars before alongside I used to be able to shift forms as easily as your Mystique. And one does not make so obvious an error unless one wants to be discovered. Everyone is silent. The real question is not, how shall we replace Fury, but, who wants Fury replaced? Come on. Fury would never say, you are not thinking clearly. You are not listening. Whoever is behind this wants to replace Fury because they do not have access to what he has. Information. Codes. Research. Possibly all of that. But they needed none of that to replace Fury for the one vital meeting required to make Earth's mightiest heroes suspicious. That one. You said as much yourself when you implied he was strained but normal until then, and afterwards. Tony whistles. Picture the enemy. They see, as you saw, an opportunity to imply Fury was compromised by this Coulson's death. By the invasion. They start to torture me. I am the key because someone, soon, will care enough find me, but no one cares now. They arrange weapons shipments to countries which are associated with those organizations most aligned against your own. Agents go missing. Never enough to be caught or arouse notice, but more than enough to confirm active suspicion. Until finally they are ready and you find out about shield weapons in the hands of terrorists, and by extension my pathetic, useless self. Steve looks like he'd like to interject, but Loki does not give him the chance. Shield security, I imagine, is moderately decent. When you arrive, things are prepared and I am allowed to be rescued. To quote Leia, they let us go. I would then tell you my story. About the Allfather sentencing me to be handed over to the humans, powerless and bound, for however long it took me to escape them. About Fury. Everything. You would blithely trot off and have him arrested. And whoever has groomed themselves to replace him as active controller of the most highly guarded source of knowledge and the most powerful team of superheroes in the world would take his place. And no one would ever know. Until far too late. Tell me, does that sound more plausible than a panicking puppet shapeshifter with no plan whatsoever other than stealing bombs? Shit. Shit foo. Tony Stark reluctantly subsides. Steve frowns. Well, no offense Loki, but if that happened, why the devil didn't Fury stop them from doing that to you? There are two alternatives. Option 1. Because I don't matter. I am a pawn. At the start he did not help me because I was a factor he was aware of, and if I were to be rescued by him they would replace me with an unknown variable. Later, possibly, because if Fury were to admit he knew about my torture, there would be questions asked and he would be told to step down, however temporarily, while they sorted it out. He would lose whatever game it is he is playing. Option number 2. I do matter. He doesn't know and simply ordered my incarceration in cell number X until he needed me and left me there to think on my wrongs. Quite possibly, in that scenario, whoever impersonated Fury for your meeting also impersonated me on the occasions Fury hypothetically visited me. Either way, my rescue most probably did not please him. He could have told someone, Steve says. I imagine he did, but given how many agents have kicked the bucket, how many more can he trust? Stark says hollowly. Loki nods. In your director's position I would have left me to rot and hoped I found the traitor before anyone with a conscience found out about the torture. Possibly, if pressured, I would have given myself an apology afterwards. And after all, whoever visited me could probably be linked fairly safely to the traitors. And I imagine the traitor is someone moderately high up. Useful information versus protecting a mass murderer. Steve looks sick. So do Stark and, surprisingly, Potts. Loki feels vaguely touched. Finally Stark says, so what the hell do we do next? We outthink them. Chapter 7. They end up skipping the movie that night. 11:30 is too late to start anything. And Loki slinks off upstairs with a muttered, I am tired, before Tony can suggest watching one anyway. Even if it weren't too late it feels wrong, somehow, starting one without all of them there. So they finish their drinks, head off to bed and think about S.H.I.E.L.D. and the plan. Or at least, he does. The plan Loki's outlined is sketchy at best, and though it's phrased a little more elegantly and specifically it boils down to, find out who will be the new director without being caught and then worry about the details. Because I cannot plan a good strategy without knowledge, Stark, the demigod had said. Tony finds it hard to drift off that night. Pepper is sleeping beside him, making a sound which is not quite snoring. More like a soft snuffling. It isn't enough to disturb him most nights she stays, but tonight his brain is in hyperactive mode and the combination kind of shoots rest to pieces. He's thinking, if he analyzes it, about torture and Loki in Afghanistan and S.H.I.E.L.D. About making contacts and calls and looking things up. About things which can go wrong, being wrong. About way too much, honestly. Maybe this is why the bad guys in the movies always look like they suffer from insomnia. Winging it is so much easier. Unfortunately, the death toll is also a lot higher. He lies there for all of 3 hours before he gives up on sleep, It's another 20 minutes before he can make himself crawl out from underneath the cozy bedding into the cold night air. Pepper mumbles, "Essent claws Espen," and rolls over, and for a moment he freezes even though the floors are covered by thick carpet and nothing ever creaks. But then she's snuffling again and he lets out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He waits a few more moments anyway before padding over to the sliding door. "Jarvis, get that for me would you? And don't disturb Pepper," he murmurs. Jarvis doesn't reply, but 2 seconds later the doors open with a quiet hiss. The hallway beyond is windowless and dark. It doesn't matter. He's practically a walking flashlight now anyway. He doesn't even need to think about it as he heads downstairs to the workshop. Sleepless nights are less common now than they were after Afghanistan and Obi, but they occur often enough for him to leave the heating on in the room each night. He's a billionaire with sustainable energy reserves. It's not like he can't afford the waste. And frankly, if he has to stay awake, he might as well stay awake being useful. It's then that he sees the lights flickering in the lounge room. His first instinct is to suit up. His second is to mentally thwack himself. He shares the house with 3 people. It's probably just Steve getting a snack or something. "Who's up, Jarvis?" "Loki, sir, Loki." "Huh," he says intelligently, and enters the room. Loki, when he enters the room, is curled up on the sofa in a position which makes Tony wince and think cramp. He has an open tub of peppermint chocolate chip ice cream at one elbow, a spoon in his left fist, and appears to be engrossed and staring absently at nothing. "Trouble sleeping?" The demigod shrugs in a way that says, "I'm here, aren't I?" "Want to talk about it?" "Not particularly Stark, they're just dreams." But at least Loki's looking at him now, even if there's something bruised about the heavy eyes. "You know, people say sometimes that it helps to talk about the stuff bothering you," he says, shelving plans for 3 separate lasers and heading for a chair. "Oh, and does it?" "Caught. Yes. Maybe," he offers weakly, "honestly, I can't say I've really tried it. More of a, if I ignore it it'll go, sort of philosophy. I tend to just let things slide." Okay, so he could definitely cross off supportive listener of the list of his qualifications. Nosy listener, on the other hand. Loki takes another spoonful of the ice cream straight from the box. Tony would worry more about hygiene if it didn't look like the Asgardian was going to have finished the thing in an hour or so anyway. "But, you know, I kind of remember, sometimes. They're not buried. More submerged. And they get me sometimes when I don't want them to. Sometimes wonder if they wouldn't if I talked about them." "Memories of when you got your arc reactor?" Tony stiffens. "Yeah, that and other things. How'd you know?" "Barton may have mentioned it." Loki admits. "Right, S.H.I.E.L.D. assassin with access to all the files. Sucked to be him. Or anyone with dirty secrets. Wait. Speaking of Clint, think we could use him for the plan?" There's a moment of silence which Tony assumes is Loki assimilating the abrupt topic change. "You think he would help me? Kind of. Hypothetically. S.H.I.E.L.D. maybe. But what if he would?" Loki frowns thoughtfully. Certainly both he and Romanoff know the workings of S.H.I.E.L.D. more intimately than we can hope to without months of undercover work. If there are any obvious enemies the girl at least may know of them. If you can get their help, we may save weeks trying to identify the person behind all this. "And then we outthink them?" "We do," Loki agrees. "Any chance of you telling me how?" "At the moment, the plan involves identifying the individual we want eliminated, and not letting them know we are trying to do so, which is, perhaps, harder. So no then. So contact Tasha and Clint. And hope they kind of don't put 2 and 2 together regarding you." "Ideally yes. Realistically, no you would do well, I think, to be honest with them. Unless you are very sure your deceptions will not fail. You will gain more through the pretense of unsolicited honesty. A gesture of good faith. I recognize enough of myself in them to be sure that being tricked will rankle." Loki pauses for another scoop of his snack. "You mean like Tasha tricked you on the helicarrier?" One dark eyebrow rises elegantly but the demigod doesn't dignify the comment with a reply. After a moment or two of pointed silence Loki shrugs and adds. "More so with Barton, because being tricked into aiding those who have hurt you by those whom you trust is not something to be forgiven lightly. But certainly if you think they can be persuaded we should make the effort. In fact, if you still have footage of my sentence it might as well be used, seeing as it is there. Torture, not sentence. And you're kidding, right?" Why would I be? And now that he looks, the demigod does appear to be genuinely confused. Well, Tony scrambles his brain, isn't that a little, I don't know, personal? Like flashbacks, questions and reliving everything? That is the point. Why should they forgive me until they are content that I have suffered sufficiently? That's sick. Sick now, Loki says carelessly, waving his spoon for emphasis, but truly, sick the day after several hundred of your humans were crushed beneath my heel. Sick when I wanted a drink and wasn't sorry in the slightest. I am not remorseful, Stark. I never have been. I can regret that I failed. I can regret that I hurt you and Steve, because you, for reasons beyond my comprehension, have helped me. Because you are my friends. But truly, I don't feel remorse. Half the time I don't even think about the consequences of what I do. I feel only a delight in the chaos itself. It isn't. I have tried for so long to get the right emotions. I always fail eventually. There's something raw and aching in the voice. And then it's shut off, replaced by a vague distaste. I am aware I am deficient. I used to think everyone had the same problems. I didn't understand why when Thor or Balder said they were sorry they were sent to bed without supper, and when said I wasn't I was whipped. The Allfather always said we were to be honest, you see. Rewarded it even. I learned first to lie, then to lie better. He looks, Tony thinks, like he expects to be kicked. Your parents whipped you? Yes. Yes, but that's not the point. The poi. How old were you? Really, Stark? Does it? Oh, very well. I must time, what, 70? 70. What's that in human years? How tall were you? Loki shoots him a dark look. Come on, spill. Fine. I was around 8. And I would have been almost waist-high to Thor. 8. What did you do? That has very little bearing on our current plans. It was tens of centuries ago and it doesn't matter. You should confine your energy to the present and let me worry about my past. Tony gives him his best puppy eyes. Loki visibly wavers. I know for a fact Tasha has a soft spot for abused kids. I was not abused. When did you do that deserved it then? At 8. It takes another 5 minutes for the Asgardian to cave. If you must know, I forged the Allfather's signature and signed away a third of our provinces in Alfheim to the Svartalheim ambassador. I used magic. It could not be undone without causing a diplomatic incident. But why? The Dark Elven ambassador was kind. One fairy in Dalmor. The Allfather hadn't remembered my birthday again and Dalmor gave me a spellbook from their archives to mark the occasion. He approached me later with the scheme and I was annoyed enough to think the payback was fair. Hey. That's kind of cool in a don't let me forget your birthday sort of way. I was still failing to earn my old man's attention building engines and getting degrees right up till he died on me. Loki stares at him for a moment, head tilted a little to one side. I found it less cool when my back was in shreds and the court was laughing at me. But they had reason. As I was informed, I displaced well over 100 Asgardians from their homes as well as giving the Dark Elves a foothold for anything from spying to murder. It was not, I think, my most benign deed. And why was it all too easy to imagine a too smart, too emotional mini Loki, trotting around with way too much freedom and far too little open affection? To imagine this, Dalmor, manipulating a kid, a little, angry kid, to get him his political foothold. And, apparently, dropping him as soon as he'd used him. Because there'd been no mention of any, can we just cancel the treaty, or comfort afterwards. And his family had let him get persuaded into that. Made a spectacle of his punishment, and laughed at him? 8. And they wonder why your emotions are screwed. He doesn't know how to put it into words, he settles for a lame. No kidding. So when's your birthday? Oh, for bore's sake, Stark, does it matter? Does any of this matter? My birthday is the 9th of November. Or at least, that's when I celebrated because I don't actually know. Are you content? Can we return to our actual business? That whole adoption thing. The demigod looks livid. Tony decides to drop it. Sure. The business being. He trails off hopefully. Loki groans and downs another spoonful of the melting mass at his elbow, possibly for fortification. Persuading Romanoff to help us. And Clint. If you can get him. If I were he I would not forgive easily. He is an excellent shot though. Seriously? That's like saying the Hulk's got a temper? True. Or that you are irritating. Tony grins at that one. Then he pulls out his phone. Joys of the modern world. What are you doing? Texting Tasha. Figure chances are she'll get up way before I wake up. Ever used a phone? No magic negated, the need for such mundane objects. Loki has uncurled from his ball now and is leaning towards him, watching. Tony grins as he taps away. The demigod's still wearing the Iron Man PJs. You free tomorrow afternoon sometime to meet up? My place? TS? And, sent. How does one use a phone? You want to use a mobile phone? I do. Tony stares at him for a moment longer than he probably should. But really, if Loki, gazillion-year-old sorcerer, wants to learn how to use a mobile, why the hell not? Alright, scoot over. When Steve comes downstairs for his morning spar, he grins. On the couch are two figures. Very much asleep. Loki is curled up into a ball and Stark is sprawled across the rest of the couch, arms hanging off the side. They're both snoring. There's an empty ice cream carton on the floor. He seats himself on the opposite chair and pulls out his sketchpad. And on the phone, an unread text says, 10 p.m., NR. Chapter 8. 10 p.m. arrives faster than Tony thinks is fair. Maybe it's because he wakes around 12, so there isn't all that much of the day left to wade through. Maybe it's because, a couple of texts later, Clint's coming over too. Which is great in that it saves time explaining things twice. It is less great in that Loki groans and says they'll have to revise their original plan of having him there from the start and break it to the agents gently instead. Because I am aiming for more in life than becoming a pincushion. Tony would defend Clint but, well, it's probably fair. And so it is decided that Loki will wait in one of the side rooms with Pepper while he and Steve do the honors explanation-wise. It's a good plan. They set up a spare study for the job, and drag in a spare couch from downstairs just to make sure they've got enough couches for everyone to sit on a different one if things get a little tense. Tony is privately surprised when Loki helps Steve carry the thing upstairs. It's shockingly easy to forget that the scrawny Asgardian went one-on-one with the captain without magic once. Especially when said Asgardian is wearing a Captain America, who can? We can, t-shirt over shapeless gray pants and Hulk smash socks? What are you wearing? Loki stiffens, an impressive feat while walking backwards through a hallway with a 60-odd kilogram leather couch. I am wearing a natively garish outfit, consisting of a t-shirt, pants and socks, and also. Way too much information, buddy. Well, you did ask, the demigod huffs. Yeah. I kind of more meant why. I am dressed. Loki sends him a look which labels him 9 kinds of stupid, as a reformed individual who is no longer a threat to the world at large. Hulk smash socks? It seemed a fitting tribute, given the nature of my defeat. That's so. Weird, Steve supplies helpfully. Weird, Tony latches onto the word. Harmlessly weird, Loki suggests hopefully. Yes. But, mainly just really not you. Well, let us hope your friends have the same reaction. Where did he get them? He mouths at Steve. Pepper, Steve says succinctly. Well, at least that explains why he probably isn't wearing an Iron Man t-shirt. You are blocking the hallway. Right, sorry, he says, edging into an adjacent bathroom. It's fine, Steve says, over the top of a muttered jab at mortals. 10 minutes later the couch is in place and Loki sinks down on it with a weary sigh. Steve looks fine, but then Tony's always felt that there are too few physical tasks which bother the super soldier. I think, Stark, that you should invest in larger elevators. I could have just flown it up, or got out the automated lifter. Loki rouses himself to sit up, shooting Tony a glare 2 notches short of a death ray. But I thought it'd be mean to spoil your fun. I don't have the energy to strangle you, Stark, but when I do, Darth Vader's Nita will be nothing compared to my you. Tony grins and sits down next to him. Then you'd have to buy your own waffle iron, and earn your money. I'm sure there'd be someone willing to reward me for the altruistic task of removing you from this realm. Still no waffle iron. That one's one of a kind. Stark Industries. No more like it, and Jarvis will zap it if you strangle me. I will copy your designs, and then I will have my revenge. Sure. If you make waffle irons like you plot world domination, old age will get me before you do. I resent that, but I don't hear any denials. Loki sends him another glare and flops his head back on the sofa, eyes half shut. You are an obnoxious, annoying buffoon. Compliments will get you nowhere, Robbie. What did you call me? Robbie, Robbie. You know, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer's son? Easier than reindeer games. Even Steve doesn't look like he gets it, Tony sighs. Should have stuck with Rudolph. They end up setting up the laptop on a coffee table in the center of the room. Tony's backed everything up on a private server. Just in case. Not that he thinks Clint will shoot it or anything. More that someone might spill coffee. Or something harmless and mundane and normal like that. The black casing gleams in the electric light in a way Tony would call evil if he were in the habit of assigning emotions to inanimate objects. He's not, so he just labels it as depressing. And it will get worse when he actually has to show their footage. No, he isn't looking forward to 10 p.m. And why is it that it's the deadlines he doesn't like which seem to come at him 10 times faster than they should? Ooh, it's 10 p.m. and Loki's safely ensconced in a side room down the other end of the corridor, reading on the iPad Tony gave him. Pepper's with him, Tony knows. She is still as wary of the demigod as he is of her, which leads to vaguely stilted conversations and long lapses of silence. Unless she's doing paperwork and Loki's got a tablet, in which case there's just silence. Tony and Steve are in the lounge room waiting, and waiting, and waiting. Shockingly, it's Steve who speaks first. So, I gather you had trouble sleeping last night? Ah, yep. But the couch was more to your tastes? Tony groans. It wasn't my fault. I only put my head back for a few seconds and then it was 12. Jarvis didn't wake me. Jarvis, why didn't you wake me? Miss Potts felt it would be unfair to disturb you, or your guest, sir. You were both sleeping very peacefully, Steve adds. Are you? You're grinning. Steve doesn't even have the grace to look apologetic. You sleep like a kid. And you hog the couch. I think I'm entitled to find it cute. Cute. Very. Jarvis, show me the footage. Uploading now, sir. Hey. He supposes they do look sort of sweet in a messy, undignified. I don't snore, he protests weakly. Steve just looks at him. I don't. Jarvis, delete that footage. Completing the task as I speak, sir. There. I don't. I suppose Loki was snoring loud enough for two. Exactly. And managing to do so at 2 different times. Yep. Steve rolls his eyes. You're as bad as Howard. And no, Tony isn't stiffening, he's just straightening up. He snored, yes. Always denied it when he woke up though, even when me and Peggy, even when there weren't any motors around to blame, he used to say we just dreamed it, or that it was thunder. Tony snickers. Yep. That's Dad, always in denial about something. You remind me of him sometimes, Steve says. Oh? He hopes he sounds mildly curious, not defensive and cold. Decades ahead of modern science. Cocky, irritating, brave, good friends. And he can deal with that. He looked for you, you know, Tony hears himself saying, during your stint as a capsicle. Never stopped. Steve shoots him a quick glance. Every year he wasn't in the workshop designing something, he was out on the ice leading another expedition for you. And if that happened to mean that Tony's care had been left to a never-ending stream of nannies, well, there was no real reason to tell the Cap that. It was years ago now. He's turned out fine. I imagine you and your mother must have been close then. Yeah. She used to see me sometimes when she remembered, in the evenings after she got home from party functions. Used to sing to me and tell me stories when she wasn't too tired. And okay, that does sound a lot lamer out loud than it did inside his head. But there's no need for Steve to shoot him that piercing look or thin his lips like that, is there? This conversation passed, awkward, 10 minutes ago. He searches blindly for a smooth topic change and manages to produce. But hey, I got lucky. Loki's dad makes mine look like parent of the year. Hell, parent of the century. That kills the mood very effectively. Steve subsides into frowning silence and Tony hums just to be annoying. At length, the captain says, "Do you know what a frost giant is?" What the hell? The only giants I know about are the ones I killed as Loki. He said his real family were frost giants. Bit small, isn't he? Aren't they like 15 feet tall or something? He's a runt. Apparently his real father left him to die because of it. Odin took him, Steve clarifies, sounding bleak. He seems. That is to say, he called himself a monster. I wasn't sure why. Well, there's an easy enough way to find out. Jarvis, Google, Frost Giant, and Loki, while you're at it, would you? Yes, sir. Are you sure it's polite to do that? Hey, I've been meaning to do it for days. Way I figure, Clint seems to have told him enough about us to make the payback fair. I still don't know. Come on, Cap. There's Norse mythology classes being taught everywhere. It isn't like we're nosing out secrets or anything. And we might be less likely to accidentally trigger him this way. The captain sighs. Okay. They're still being filled in on Jotuns, foremost enemies of the Asgardian gods. The horse, Balder, needles and cross-dressing when Clint and Tasha roll up. Jarvis gives them advanced warning. Everything Loki-related has been shut down by the time the assassins get upstairs. Ooh, hey Tony, Clint says, giving him a manly punch to the upper arm and making a beeline for the liquor cabinet. Tasha produces a Tony, Steve, and heads for the chairs. Both the agents look like they've crawled through a bombshell blast and back. There's a gash on Clint's arm bound with a strip of torn cloth which looks like it was once someone's top or coat. Someone's very grimy top or coat. Even Tasha's form-fitting garb looks trashed. Don't worry about getting dirt and blood on the couches. They're only brand new leather. The archer grins and makes his way over to them, glass in hand. I'll pretend that was genuine, Tony. I'm beat. Fucking terrorists with their fucking hostages. Long day? Steve asks. You could say so. So, how does mundane anonymity compare to the glories of superheroing? Let's just say I'd take normal any day, Clint says, and just for a moment there's something haunted in his voice. Then it's gone. Nope, nailing terrorists has all the old appeal. Plus it's what I trained for. I've got better things to do than sign fucking autographs and press releases all day. Steve looks surprisingly sympathetic. I take it the mission went well? Yep. Thanks for the details, Clint. Made for a fascinating story. The archer snorts. Shield business, Tony, Tasha says unapologetically. You can hack into the database if you are that interested. He isn't. Still. Yeah, you have a point there. Shield security's got more holes than Dutch cheese after the mice have been at it. Clint snorts. Tasha frowns. Oh, she says, and no, it absolutely does not surprise Tony that she would be the one concerned by this. Really? I broke into it about a week ago, actually. You know Mark II Tesseract weapons were being sold off to Doom. The agents exchange unreadable glances. Not to mention the warheads disappearing off to North Korea. The fuck they are. Who's in charge of that division? Fury. And under him Keppel, Tasha says shortly, was this why you called us? Kind of. That and other things. Info's on a laptop upstairs, whenever you're ready. Another assignment already, Clint groans. Fury had better be paying overtime. Fury kind of doesn't know about this at all, Tony says. Tasha raises an eyebrow at him. But if you're after being paid overtime, well buddy, one word for you, billionaire. Alright, Tony. I trust you. I'm not saying I'll do it, mind, but I'll listen. Just give me 10 minutes and a drink first, will you? Done. Steve hems. There is just one thing. We'd prefer. That is to say, this one's us, not S.H.I.E.L.D. We'd prefer it if you wouldn't talk about this with your superiors. Tasha and Clint exchange unreadable glances. I suppose we can do that, Tasha says, reluctantly, but only if it doesn't threaten national security. Don't make me regret doing this for you though, Tony. With that she pulls of 2 bugs and switches off her cell phone. Clint does the same. Tony breathes out, long and slow, thanks, he says. And means it. 2 drinks and 10 minutes later, they go upstairs. It turns out that they don't need all 4 sofas in the room because the agents sit together and so do Tony and Steve. Tony decides he'll rub the into Robbie later. Steve rises and prepares himself to start talking, because they agreed that his words, as a mature, responsible war hero, will hold more weight. Or at least, Loki and Pepper did and Tony was outvoted. Only, before the captain can start, Clint says, "Can I just ask, before we get into this, where's the bathroom?" Way to break the mood. Just down the corridor to the left, Steve says. Jarvis will direct you if you can't find it. It's only 10 minutes later, when he hears the smash, that Tony remembers that the bathroom is directly opposite Pepper. And Loki. Chapter 9. Loki has always enjoyed talking. Thor hits things, Tyr doesn't care how they die so long as they do, and Balder went around being nice. And Loki talks his way into trouble and out of it, and half the fun of it is seeing how close he can dance to the knife's edge without being slit. Unfortunately, now is promising to be one of those times he should have remained silent. Of course, it wasn't so much what he'd said. He only asked why the mortals kept on burning oil if they thought it would warm the planet and kill everyone. Unfortunately, he hadn't counted on there being someone in the hallway outside their room to hear him. More specifically, a certain former minion with issues who doesn't look like he's been updated on anything important at all. Not unless holding a readied bow and scowling have suddenly become signs of mortal trust. I will put green dye in your laundry for this, Steve, if I live. I will paint bright pink serpents on your shield. What in Helheim were you wasting your time discussing? He has risen, of course. In fact, he has, with one jump, put an entire couch between himself and the armed assassin. What the fuck are you doing here? Barton rasps. A careless lift of one eyebrow. Reading on Stark's couch. The fuck you are. The archer is aiming at him now, and Loki narrows his eyes and squares his shoulders, daring him to do it. He has cover. The odds are in his favor that the mortal will miss. Barton opts for shrewdly circling around the couch instead. Loki keeps pace. His palms are sweating and he's suddenly, irrationally, angry. He is not nervous and he is not frightened, he is Loki. And then Potts says sharply, Clint, haven't you been filled in on anything? Filled in? Like you and Stark fucking knew he was there? Just when were you planning on telling me you'd signed on Mr. Humans are ants, so let's squash them onto our little job? Loki flushes slightly. I don't think you are all ants anymore. Steve was supposed to tell you an hour ago, Potts says tartly. Oh, we only got here round 11. You know, out saving the whole fucking world from people like him. Barton makes a heroic effort to get a clear line to Loki as he says this, springing over the couch which separates them. Unfortunately for the mortal, Loki is equally athletic under pressure and vaults it at the same time. Barton glares at him across the reinstated barrier. Loki offers a lopsided grin. You should know by now that there are no people like me. Still reusing the same old lines. Fucking lazy, that's what that is. Lazy is using the word, fuck, for emphasis in every sentence you produce, Loki retorts, stung. An arrow whistles past, dangerously close to his ear as he ducks down. It sticks into a chair behind him, quivering. Would you two stop that, Clint? He's served his sentence. He's legally as innocent as you and me now. So stop trying to shoot him. Her voice is rising dangerously and 2 spots of red are burning in her cheeks. Is Potts worried for me? He shakes the thought aside. He needs to focus on Barton, who is, he realizes, speaking. The fuck he has. It's been 3 months. He shouldn't be released in his own fucking lifetime, let alone mine. The Allfather's justice is beyond contestation. Yeah. Daddy's little kid being let off with a rap over the knuckles. Well, we don't run that way here. You should have had the sense to stay the fuck away from Earth for the next 50 years. A rap over the knuckles. He does laugh then. A rasping thing, with no mirth and more than a little insanity. He is not my father, and I'm afraid I didn't have that option. Oh, because I thought your brother took you back to fucking Asgard with your fucking Tesseract. So forgive me for thinking you had a fucking choice about coming back here. He's not my brother. But then Thor's gullibility is as legendary as Volstag's appetite. All you mortals are when it comes to illusionary images. He believed whatever the Allfather wanted him to believe and never bothered to come when I needed him. Where were you, Thor? He's aware his taunting grin has devolved into a haunted grimace. He gathers the shreds of his composure together. Oafs, the lot of you. If I had my magic I'd be behind you with a dagger through your back while you were still saying, fuck. He throws himself sideways as another arrow flies through the sofa's leather backing a mere 2 inches away from his nose. Loki, stop taunting Clint. Loki spares Potts his, I don't think so, look. If I had a taser I would tase both of you. If you had a taser I would have stolen it hours ago and used it by now to fell Barton. She glares at him before rounding on the archer. Clint, he never left. Tony decided to go on a rescue mission for him with Steve last week. He was in prison all that time. Clint hesitates in the act of stringing his next arrow. Doesn't that mean he didn't serve his sentence? My sentence was having my magic bound and being handed over, injured and helpless, to S.H.I.E.L.D. Loki bites out, what happened to me after that was purely my own fault. The result of my own deficiencies in diplomacy and strength. Whether the mortals released me the next day or decided to hack my head off made no difference to the fulfillment of the sentence. That's. Barton trails off, so you could have been out in a day? After everything? Loki glares at him. Yes, and if I'd had my way I would have been. Seriously, your daddy just accept you back after one day? After all the shit you pulled? My dad, who need I remind you is not, sentenced Thor to exile until he proved worthy for traveling to Jotunheim, realm of the frost giants, and slaughtering hundreds of the monsters for calling him a princess. Hundreds. For a petty insult. Of course, they are less than insects and deserving of nothing but contempt. The sort of monsters who lie and hurt and unmake you for fun. But the Allfather claims they are not, and they are undeniably sentient. 3 days, Barton. 3 days with a pretty mortal and one noble death courtesy of myself. And all was forgiven, because he had fulfilled the sentence and was worthy. Monsters like you mean, the assassin remarks, ignoring the Thor parts of the little monologue. Monsters exactly like me, Loki says with an ugly laugh. Potts shoots him a complicated look he can't be bothered deciphering. He focuses instead on dodging to the side as another missile flies past and winces as it digs into the coffee table. But no clean slate or no, I will not return to Asgard. I do not mind living in Thor's shadow and fixing every mistake they make when I stand beside them as equals. As a mere creature. As nothing but a dog, happy enough to be whipped so long as I am able to subsist on their scraps? I refuse. Because I'm sure life as a fucking second prince was unbearable. Words, 1,000 slights, 1,000 incidents, stick in his throat. You know nothing of my life. Nothing. He's being backed into a corner. There are just 3 chairs separating him from total loss of cover now. He's hunted enough times to know what it looks like to be the prey. Clint, he's served his sentence. You didn't see the footage of him when Tony rescued him. He threw Tony out a window and I feel sorry for him. I don't need your pity, you sure as fuck aren't getting mine. 2 chairs. He actually thinks he might like the archer if the mortal were not forcing him to flee like a demented goose. If you didn't like the Allfather's justice you should not have returned me to him. Yeah, because your brother wouldn't have fucking smashed us if we'd tried to keep you. He's not my brother. I am no one's son and I have no family. 1 chair. Yeah? Keep telling yourself that. You don't fucking deserve him anyway. In retrospect, that's where things start to go wrong. Or at least, more wrong than they are. Because there is no cover now, and he's backed into a corner and he hates the feeling of being trapped. Don't move 1 more fucking inch. Pout to his left, the cold glass and the reflections he can feel behind the curtains. Perhaps it is the memory of helplessness. Of rough hands in glaring brightness. Of no way out and nothing that he can say to make it stop. Or perhaps it's that cold honesty. The bald statement of truth. You don't fucking deserve him anyway, he doesn't know. Only knows that something snaps. Loki does move. Quite deliberately. He has survived the abuse of the cell. If he has lived through that, he can live through 1 more arrow before he strangles Barton. No matter what logic tells him are his odds of successfully doing so. And then the arrow is released straight at his throat and he thinks it's odd because surely they can both see that it will be blocked by the iron collar? Surely Barton should have targeted the chest? The force of the blow knocks him back half a pace and he stumbles back into shelf behind him with an undignified, oof. A vase topples and shatters and the carpet is wet. Covered in glass and water and slimy lily stems. There's 1 moment, where he hears Barton say, "That was a warning, and it's the only one you'll get." 1 moment where he feels the newly dented collar growing warm and feels like borrowing the phrase, shit, from Stark's vocabulary. Because of course the Allfather warded it. Of course Loki would not just be allowed to damage it with Stark's lasers or with potent acids. Or with arrows, of course not. He's just not that lucky. He has 1 precious moment more. Possibly he should have used it to damn Barton to Helheim and all the torments dear Hela could conceive. Or at least tried to choke him. Instead he just stares at the man like an idiot, eyes wide with gathering pain. And then he's falling and falling into the sharp dampness and he's shaking and his throat is burning and it's like the emptiness of the void and the fires of Muspelheim have joined forces to consume him. He wants to scream and scream until the world ends, but his throat isn't working and he wants Thor, and why won't Thor come? He's clawing at his throat and he needs the pain to stop, and why aren't his arms working? Someone's saying, fuck, 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 and someone else is barking out, get back, and, you'll be okay, and he doesn't know why. Doesn't know anything. His world has shrunk, collapsed in on itself to leave just the heart which threatens to break with each painful thud and the white agony that claws its way through each nerve like Chitauri venom. There's a mewling noise like a beaten dog, and he doesn't care enough to give a damn that it's coming from him. There's nothing now but this. Tony makes eye contact with Steve for all of 2 seconds as the crash echoes through the room. Then the super soldier's up and running and out by the time Tony's up and saying, shit. Tony, Tasha says sharply. He's halfway over to the doorway now? Tony, you're not suiting up. What is it? She's keeping pace beside him with all the ease of a trained athlete beside an out-of-shape has-been. Which is a really bad parallel, now he thinks about it, because he's perfectly fit and even exercises. Sometimes. When he's not busy designing things. You know that whole search for number 67? He waits for her brief nod before saying, Loki. Believe it or not, we didn't know, till he was out. There wasn't enough of him beneath the red and purple to recognize. Beatings. Assault. Broken bones. You name it, they did it. We were going to break the news that he was with us to you a bit more gently, but I think, yeah. Tasha's lips thin. I see. He said, Loki, that we should be upfront because you were in a position to either screw things up or help out, and you probably wouldn't want to be blindsided into helping him. Not that it really. I mean, I don't think Clint could really have found out much less smoothly, or you. Tasha starts running in earnest then, and Tony just tries to keep up and ends up entering the room a full 30 seconds behind her. By the time he does, the scene is in full swing. Arrows quiver from both the sofas, 3 coffee tables and 4 of the 5 chairs. He's mean enough to consider making Clint pay for the replacements. Pepper's standing there, pale, her lips thinned in a way which suggests they're going to have a very long talk about the advisability of carrying tasers in the near future. Clint's next to Tasha, saying something in an undertone about shooting, and insane, and not my fault. And then his eyes are drawn straight down to the shaking demigod curled inwards on the ground near the window. Eyes rolled up to the whites and doing his deranged best to tear his own throat out under the collar. He's whimpering and his fingers are curled into jagged claws, and Tony's just glad it's Steve who's holding his straining arms back and not him. Shit. What the hell did you do to him? And okay. Barton got brainwashed and forced to shoot his friends by Loki, and Tony should probably be a bit more lenient, but right now he isn't feeling reasonable. I didn't do a fucking thing, Barton says, lies, defensively, not to cause that shit. Look at that. That isn't nothing, that's our resident demigod squirming on the floor like a cat whose tail just got squashed by a truck. He was fine right up until the collar got hit, Pepper interjects, though he seemed to lose it a bit when he got backed into the corner. You shot his collar? What if you'd missed? His throat's under that? He looked ready to strangle me. I had to shoot somewhere to let him know I was serious. I didn't know it'd do this. You'd think him eating waffles was an indication of deadly intentions. Clint rubs his neck awkwardly, no denials there. What the fuck was he even doing here anyway? We sprung him from S.H.I.E.L.D. a week ago, Tony bites out. I told him that, Pepper adds. The fuck you did, Tony. What about Coulson? Wordlessly, Tony stalks from the room. Wordlessly he returns with the laptop. Jarvis, bring up the footage of Loki. The stuff from the cell. Clint looks rebellious and a bit guilty, which is good but not good enough. Tasha's features are impassive. Steve is still holding Loki, who's still making those noises which make Tony want to punch someone. And if he can't target the Allfather for putting on their equivalent of a shock collar on his adopted son, Clint is an acceptable stand-in. Pepper kneels down next to Steve and asks quietly if there's anything she can do. There's not. And then the footage is being shown and it's just as bad as Tony remembers. Worse. Because this isn't just an unknown stranger, bad as that was. This is the person who is wearing a Captain America t-shirt and laughs at Han Solo and can't stand the smell of lemons. Fuck, Clint breathes. Tasha's expression has gone from impassive to closed. Look as long as you want, Tony offers unkindly. Fuck.